Hello students in my classes at Sac State and YouTube. Welcome to this lecture on the series of Gilgamesh. This will be a philosophical overview or somewhat comprehensive introduction to the series, which we'll be covering in 2 or 3 weeks in class. And since it's a longer one, you can divide it up into 2 or 3 parts. Gilgamesh is tremendous or stupendous, ungeheure. I consider it to be the greatest thing that can happen to a person, the German poet Rainer Maria Rilke exclaimed in 1916. He went on in his letters, hopes long cherished were now to be realized, or were to end in disappointment. Visions of palaces underground, of gigantic monsters, of sculpted figures, and endless inscriptions floated before me. After forming plan after plan for removing the earth and extricating these treasures, I fancied myself wandering in a maze of chambers from which I could find no outlet. What Rilke had found in the Epic of Gilgamesh was a living labyrinth, this epic of the fear of death, as he called it. He also called it the Primal Saga, or Ursag, and hoped it would one day be recast with the greatest freedom of fantasy into a unified form, and this has been attempted over and again. Rilke also appreciated the gaps and lacunae in the early Ugnad scholarly edition he read, which somehow, quote, have a constructive effect by keeping apart the splendidly massive surface of the fragments. What the saga poetizes is for Rilke an epochal shift, an axial era before the axial age, wherein, quote, for the first time, the separation of life and death had become definitive and fateful. Gilgamesh celebrated the 150th year of its rediscovery just recently in 2022. It has even been translated into Klingon, and there is a Star Trek Next Generation episode inspired by it. Captain Picard abbreviates it as an epic of friendship in adversity. As Sophus Hella remarks in his wonderful recent translation, which I'll use here, unlike Greek or Roman classics, Gilgamesh comes to us unburdened by reception, open to new eyes. As Schmidt puts it, it has not had time to sink in. Gilgamesh is one of the earliest long narrative poems or extended works of literary mythology to come down to us, at least 1,000 years older than the Iliad or the Bible. Even more amazing, it was buried by history for almost 2 millennium when knowledge of cuneiform script was lost and then refound. Ali Smith dubs it the original epic of human self-knowledge. For Rilke, Gilgamesh concerns our very existence. For Ziolkowski, it is a cultural seismograph through which we measure the tremors in our society in the way we retell it. It has symbolized all things to all readers: the longing for immortality, loss, grief, homoeroticism, kingship, friendship, the truth about sex, climate catastrophe, and more. It has also become a rich heritage for Middle Eastern historians, poets, and artists, since the Iraqi modernists began reclaiming its legacy after the first Arabic version was published in the 1960s. This unsettled Euro-Christian narratives, and it was used to both promote and critique nationalist agendas. Michael Schmidt even wonders whether Gilgamesh is the first road novel. Think Kerouac on the road, the first trip to hell, the first deluge, the first homosexual romance in poetry, and the first tale of the uneasy triumph of nurture over nature. Sophus Hella is even happy to call Gilgamesh a, quote, work of passionate philosophy. Passionate because, unlike many of the heroic models we inherit, Gilgamesh weeps and worries, hugs and begs, mourns and dreams, far more than he fights. And philosophy because of his sustained and sometimes reflective quest for self-knowledge. Despite being hyperactive, aggressive, and rash, it turns out that Gilgamesh is not the, quote from Hella, hyper-masculine warrior we are told to expect in the opening pages. His greatest military success, defeating the monster Humbaba, is made possible only by the intervention of his mother. In the end, the most significant event in his life is not heroic triumph, but resounding defeat, his failure to achieve immortality. Gilgamesh has been called an epic, a tragedy, even a comedy, but it doesn't very well fit our definitions of genre since Aristotle's Poetics. As Schmidt points out, Gilgamesh is agon or struggle literature, as well as historical chronicle. But as to genre, it is an anthology of genres: praise poetry, prayer, debate, dialogue, diatribe, dream, and lament. We also don't know to what extent an oral tradition coexisted with a written tradition, or when. When we read Gilgamesh today in one of the more accessible translations or adaptations, it seems extremely accessible and familiar. But however familiar, a hero tale very well told, Gilgamesh is an alien text that we must learn to defamiliarize. Its uncanny strangeness renders its meaning radically fluid. Perhaps more than any other popular text to come down to us from remote antiquity, Gilgamesh quote forces scholars to take creative risks and general readers to make scholarly choices. This is part of the reason why it's become, since the 1970s, a favorite addition to literature and humanities curriculums. Reading Gilgamesh and making those scholarly choices, as you do, in how to interpret it, will hone your reading and thinking ability considerably. As to the texts themselves, we have versions of Gilgamesh in 7 more or less related languages, spanning centuries. This has made reconstruction of Gilgamesh the literary jigsaw puzzle of all time. It had to be, and is still being, reconstructed from thousands of cuneiform tablets found in Iraq and all over the Near East, and now scattered in museums around the world. As to versions, there is an Old Babylonian version and a Standard Babylonian version, abbreviated OB and SB, respectively, and these are the 2 main ones. But there's also a Sumerian cycle, a version found in Ugarit, and an Assyrian version, and a translation into Hittite and Hurrian. Sumerian, as an isolate spoken language, died out around 2000 BCE, but it continued for another 2 millennia as a language of scholarship and religious ritual. The Akkadian language split into Babylonian in the south and Assyrian in the north. There are 5 extant Sumerian tablets of Gilgamesh, but most of what survives was written in Babylonian dialects of Akkadian, and the best preserved manuscripts are by later Assyrian speakers. To be sure, the most complete and elegant version is the Standard Babylonian version in 12 tablets, which was discovered in the Royal Library of King Ashurbanipal, 7th century BCE, and other versions are incorporated to fill out the many gaps and uncertainties. Tablet 12 sits very uneasily in the plot, as we'll see by the end of this lecture. In all these literary sources, cuneiform script, the world's oldest writing system, was used, and this is the reason why the tale and its various scenes, more resembling episodes in a TV series than chapters in a book, have survived. Cuneiform script involves making wedge-shaped reed stylus markings in soft clay tablets that harden when dried, and more so when fired. While brittle and easy to break, such tablets last incomparably longer than papyrus or wax, and this is why it was possible to rediscover Gilgamesh at all. As Hella points out, around 500,000 cuneiform texts have been excavated, a larger corpus than classical Latin, though many remain unread and unpublished, as the world has only a few hundred scholars with the expertise needed to decipher them. Because of the vast array of sources, many untapped, Gilgamesh as a text is still in the process of being rediscovered, reconfigured, and rethought. New pieces of evidence that fill out gaps or enhance scholars' ability to draw out linguistic connotations or to speculate further on cultural context keep appearing all the time. The definitive editions of Gilgamesh of the next 10, 50, or 100 years will be different than the ones we have today. The Gilgamesh we have is short. It's thought we possess 3,000 of the 3,500 lines, in comparison to the Iliad's 16,000 lines, or even longer epics. As every scholar notes, in the Standard Babylonian version, the incipit, or start, was "He who saw the deep," but in the Old Babylonian version, it was "He who surpasses all kings." The epic is set in the city of Uruk, an independent city-state of ancient Sumer, until the conquest of Sargon of Akkad in the 23rd century BCE. This makes the Gilgamesh character a Sumerian king. From later king lists, it has either been taken for granted or argued for that Gilgamesh was a real historical person who lived between 2800 and 2500 BCE. Evidence for this historical Gilgamesh, however, is scanty, and it doesn't much matter here. The tale opens and closes in an uruk of the historical imagination, with a beautiful, even technical description of the city's bustling activity. Orchards, clay pits, temples, and dwellings, all from the perspective of a suitably impressive city wall, thought to have been constructed by the historical king, all dimensions quite exaggerated. The first tablets of the standard Babylonian version were discovered in 1851 among the ruins of the library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh by Austin Henry Layard, and the gradual recovery of Gilgamesh is its own great story you can enjoy in Damrosch's buried book, The Loss and Rediscovery of the Great Epic of Gilgamesh. Akkadian was declared deciphered by the Royal Asiatic Society in 1857, when a number of scholars produced independent translations placed in sealed envelopes that were thankfully declared to be sufficiently similar. However, Gilgamesh was not widely noticed by almost anyone outside of a tiny group of scholars until 1872, when George Smith, one of the first salaried Assyriologists, translated and publicized Tablet 11 with its stunning pre-biblical flood myth. This shocked Victorian England, causing an international sensation. According to Wallace Budge, the famous Assyriologist and Egyptologist, upon finding this pre-biblical deluge tale, Smith went into an ecstasy and may have disrobed in the British Museum, emulating Enkidu. Budge describes, quote, "His theory produced in him an almost incredible state of mental excitement. He said, 'I am the first man to read that after more than 2,000 years of oblivion.' Setting the tablet on the table, he jumped up and rushed about the room in a great state of excitement, and to the astonishment of those present, began to undress himself." Hella thinks that this story should be taken with a grain of salt, but it certainly appears to be a satisfying imitation of the story of Archimedes running naked through the streets of Syracuse and shouting, "Eureka!" The Daily Telegraph, rather than the British government, financed Smith's trip to Iraq to confirm the finding, but then pulled the funding as soon as Smith discovered the Atrahasis tablet, the background of the flood tale. Mission accomplished. In his book Gilgamesh Among Us, Tsiolkovsky provides a fascinating account, which I'll use frequently here, of the theological, academic, literary, artistic, and cultural reception of Gilgamesh, beginning around 1884 and continuing to 2009. Of course, the reception has only expanded since then. The story of the flood was found in Tablet 11 of Gilgamesh, and it is remarkably well preserved, the best preserved tablet, in fact, but it and all the epic's tablets are incomplete. As Hella puts it, Gilgamesh comes to us as a broken echo. When Andrew George completed his magisterial edition in 2003, there were a total of 184 fragments of the standard Babylonian version, and more have been discovered since, resulting in additions or emendations. Alongside his 2-volume scholarly tome, George also published a Penguin Classics edition, here on the left, for the general reader. Other editions with impeccable scholarly credentials include Benjamin Foster's Second Norton Critical Edition and Stephanie Daly's Oxford World Classics. The earlier Penguin edition by Nancy Sanders from 1960 was very influential for decades, but was written in quasi-King James biblical prose and extremely loose with the ending. Since the 1980s, there have been dozens of translations and even more renderings or new versions, mostly by poets and scholars in other fields or dilettantes, and usually without any knowledge of the original languages. These include, to convey its beauty, David Ferry and Jenny Lewis, or to bring out its immediacy and clarity, Nancy Sanders and Stephen Mitchell. It's worth enjoying all of these translations, but we must also remember that they are translations of translations. They often tell us more about ourselves and the Gilgamesh we want to hear. The Stephen Mitchell is probably the most popular hybrid of translation and retelling, but its hypermasculinity has turned off some readers. Jenny Lewis is at the opposite pole, teasing out a more feminine-centric universe for Gilgamesh that may or may not go back to earlier Sumerian culture and values. Perhaps the best middle ground between translation and retelling is the new Sophus Hella. I tend to assign either the Stephen Mitchell or the Sophus Hella, depending on the level of the class, but any of these translations will do, although keep in mind how the translation you choose will inevitably color your perspective and interpretation. Also, for those who prefer to listen to the epic than read it, George Guidall does a remarkable job in his narration of the Stephen Mitchell version, which I've uploaded for you in Canvas. So the Gilgamesh scholarship is massive and unwieldy, definitely too much to bite off for a non-specialist like myself or for students in a survey class. Mostly in this lecture, I'll be using Sophus Hella's interpretive remarks, but I'll also be drawing frequently from Michael Schmidt's The Life of a Poem, which focuses on the literary reception and issues of poetic theory, as well as Theodore Ziolkowski's Gilgamesh Among Us, Modern Encounters with the Ancient Epic, which gives an amazing overview of almost every aspect of the modern reception of Gilgamesh in Western culture and the arts. By the epilogue, we'll even briefly look into a recent adaptation by the Italian author and publisher Roberto Calasso. These all seem like good introductory places to start. For those interested in delving deeper and in a more scholarly way in English, Hella recommends the explanatory chapters in George's tome, as well as the Louis M. Pryke study in the Routledge series, Gods and Heroes of the Ancient World, and especially Martin Worthington's highly original Ea's Duplicity in the Gilgamesh Flood story. I have not yet read these 3 volumes, but if I ever do a Gilgamesh lecture part 2, it'll be focused on these 3 books. That being some general explanatory situating of the Epic of Gilgamesh, let's dive into the text itself. The standard Babylonian version dates to around 1200 BCE and is attributed to Sîn-leqi-unnenni in Ashurbanipal's library catalogue. It draws from and cites older versions, adding key passages, such as the prologue itself. We know next to nothing about Sîn-leqi-unnenni, except that he was an incantation priest or exorcist. The myths surrounding him were embellished by later authors, for example, projecting him back into history as Gilgamesh's chief scribe. The practice of attributing the standard version to Sîn-leqi-unnenni is probably no more and no less accurate than that of attributing the Iliad or the Odyssey to a single author named Homer. In any case, the standard version actively shapes Gilgamesh into a coherent whole, the end tying back into the beginning as the reader gazes over the walls of Uruk. Here is how the standard version begins in Hella's literal translation in his introduction. It begins, "Who saw the depth or the totality, the foundations of the land, who knew the ways, understanding everything. Gilgamesh, who saw the depth or the totality, the foundations of the land, who knew the ways, understanding everything. He examined each of the matching throne daises and grasped the sum of knowledge about everything. He saw the secret and opened the covered. He brought back a report from before the flood. He came a distant road and so was exhausted, and given peace, all his hardships being set on a stele, or he set down his trials on a slab of stone. He built the wall of Uruk, the sheepfold, of holy Inana, the pure storehouse. See its walls, which is like a thread of tufted wool, or like the shining of copper. Look at its parapet, which no one will equal. Take the threshold, or the stairway, which is of former times, and draw near to Inana, Ishtar's dwelling, which no future king whatsoever will equal. Go up on top of the wall of Uruk and walk around. Examine the foundation base, inspect the brickwork. Check if its brickwork is not oven-baked bricks, and if the 7 sages did not lay its foundation. 1 sar is city, 1 sar is orchard, 1 sar is clay pits, half a sar is Ishtar's temple. 3.5 sar is Uruk, its measurements. I began the prologue with Hella's interpolated literal translation, just to give us a sense of the ambiguities that are still being discussed, and that may or may not be resolved as our knowledge of the language improves in the future. One of the foci of the prologue is the Inana, which is Ishtar's, or Inanna's, formerly Anne's temple in Uruk. Inanna's home is the House of Heaven, also a storehouse, as the poem indicates, and interestingly, its dimensions are only 1/2 of the other precincts. In his keynote lecture, which you can see on YouTube, Andrew George underlines how the wall, often focused on as Gilgamesh's monument, is perhaps less important than the 4 precincts. From the wall, we're asked to look at the city, the dwelling houses, the date grove, or the food production, the clay pit, or the manufacturing industry, and the temple, or the spiritual and intellectual life of the city. Together, the description of Uruk's 4 quarters symbolize the, quote, sum of human life. Switching now to Hella's poetic renditions, the prologue continues. Now look for the cedar wood box. Undo its locks of bronze. Open the door to its secrets. Take up the tablet of lapis lazuli and read aloud. Read of all that Gilgamesh went through. Read of all his suffering. That the prologue concludes with the suffering or travails of Gilgamesh has led many a reader to understand this epic as also a tragedy. While the genre is contested, everyone agrees that the literary framing or framework, parerga, of the prologue is an effective invitation into the narrative. It appears to have been added around 1200 to 1000 BCE. Let your imagination dwell on the wall, the city's 4 parts, and the box at the base of the wall. Unlock the box for yourself and take out the tablets. Read of the travails of Gilgamesh, of what Gilgamesh went through. The prologue is also a very early example of the literary technique called ekphrasis, which is the use of a detailed description of a work of art as a literary example or microcosm that the artist then poeticizes into the hearer's imagination. The most famous example of ekphrasis is Achilles' shield, but in the case of Gilgamesh, the art object, poetically envisioned, is itself a text, a kingly chronicle, etched on finest lapis lazuli stone. Earlier in the prologue, we were told that Gilgamesh set down his trials on a slab of stone, possibly suggesting that the text you are about to read is Gilgamesh's own autobiography, and a strange one at that, since it's an autobiography told in the 3rd person, narrated by a scribe. How the prologue can be understood in light of the identical, often judged to be disappointing or anticlimactic ending has been much discussed. In Study the Brickwork, Hella remarks the tale is, quote, like a snake biting its own tail, telling the story of its own creation, eager for one more spin around the walls, propelling itself through time, and so carrying Gilgamesh's name into eternity. Here the prologue ends, and the older Babylonian version begins at line 29. He surpassed all kings, that splendid man of muscle, heroic son of Uruk, the goring aurochs or ur-oxen, an extinct species. When he marched at the front, he was the leader of his army. When he marched at the back, the trust of his troops, a mighty riverbank, the shield of his soldiers, a furious flood that crushes walls of stone, the calf of Lugalbanda, superb in strength, nursed by Ninsun, the holy aurochs, Gilgamesh, the great, magnificent and terrible. He cut passes through the mountains, he dug wells in the hillsides, he traveled towards sunrise, crossing sea after sea. He searched in all directions for life without end. He reached through his toils the faraway Uta-napishti. He rebuilt the temples that the flood had destroyed and established the right rituals for vast humankind. Here we learn for the first time about Gilgamesh's lineage, the son of Lugalbanda, a mortal king, and how he was nursed by his mother, the wise livestock goddess Ninsun, who was also the mother of Dumuzi. And we learn about his qualities, even his status as a religious founder of sorts, since it was Gilgamesh who restored the temples and rite rituals from before the flood. Perhaps his quest wasn't so unsuccessful after all, and yet we have no Gilgamesh religion, as we have religions of Akhenaten or Zoroaster, only the tale. Who can compete with him in kingship and claim, and say, like Gilgamesh, "I am the king"? From the day that Gilgamesh was born and named, he was 2/3 god, only 1/3 human. The mother goddess Belit-ili designed his body, and the wise god Ea brought his figure to perfection, so that he brimmed with strength and shining beauty. He was a giant in height, 18 feet tall, and his chest was 6 feet broad. His feet were 5 feet long, and twice that his leg, and the length of his stride was the same. His beard, too, was 5 feet long. Belit-ili, the mother goddess who designed humans in the Atrahasis tablet, also designed Gilgamesh's body. We also learn that Ea, or Enki, took an interest in Belit-ili's work, and that Ea perfected Gilgamesh. The first of many examples in the epic of Enki's more peripheral but always decisive influence on his destiny. Soon we will learn that Shamash, the sun god, protects Gilgamesh, and that Aruru, a vegetation or birth goddess, is allied to Gilgamesh, since it is she who creates his beloved companion, Enkidu. Gilgamesh is more than a demigod, half god, half human. He's 2/3 divine. But why? It doesn't add up, logically speaking, to the modern mind, since we don't think in Mesopotamian. We might point out that Gilgamesh was made or nurtured by many gods, or that his father, Lugalbanda, became a divinized king, which may play a role in his 2/3 status. Some, such as Moran, have read the purpose of the series as that of sounding the death knell to divine kingship. Previous kings from the 3rd through the 1st millennium BCE often claimed immortal status, but after Gilgamesh, all such claims have come to an end. In the narrative world of the SBV, there was only ever one truly immortal man, Uta-napishti. Gilgamesh's failure to achieve absolute divinization, including immortality, never dying, appears to mark the end of the era of divinized mortals, an epochal shift towards mortal finitude. According to Sophisela and other scholars he draws from, alongside Shamash, the sun god and Gilgamesh's personal protector, the two other most important deities who play intriguingly central roles in Gilgamesh's destiny, other than his mother, Ninsun, are Ea, or Enki, the god of wisdom, but more indirectly, and Ishtar, more directly, and most often conflictually. In the standard version, at line 61, we meet Gilgamesh oppressing his people, a typical tyrant, wearing out the young men in wrestling or ball games, and claiming what will much later be called prima noctis, or first night rites, with all of the brides. The people cry out to the gods in despair, and the attentive gods listen to their sorrow. Gilgamesh, the shepherd and protector, because he has no equal, has become an oppressor. It is Anu, the father of heaven and father of the gods, who tasks Aruru to create Gilgamesh's double or counterpart. Quote, "Let him be a match for the storm of his heart. Let them rival each other and leave Uruk at peace." Here and throughout the text, the scribal culture that adored and retold Gilgamesh begins its extended meditation on the proper limits of kingship. It's likely that the literate elite who wrote down Gilgamesh in innumerable copies had courtly roles, and thus educating and guiding a king's impulses more constructively was of chief concern. The moral lesson here is almost playful. When a king gets out of hand, distract him from his destructive impulses and the affairs of state. Give him instead a suitable companion to help channel his impulses. That it is Enkidu who fits the bill is a bit psychologically complicated. It may be that Gilgamesh yearns for connection to the wild nature absent in his urban rule. It may be that he's in need of a male companion equal to himself. While modern sexual identities don't readily apply to these historical contexts, there is a fair bit of drag, transgenderism, androgyny, as well as bi and pansexuality in the literary and religious texts of the period, which makes a reading of the text as a tale of homoeroticism not implausible. So let's now look at the character of Enkidu, who we'll understand here somewhat anachronistically as Edenic humanity. Enkidu is created from Anu's idea, thought, or consciousness as it finds its form in Aruru's heart. Aruru representing the vegetative and animal fertility of the earth. Ready to receive this great thought of Anu, Aruru washes her hands and gathers a lump of clay. Recall, this is also how the original humans were made, but mixed with a god's blood in the Atrahasis tablet. And then Aruru throws the clay into the wild. In the wild, she created the hero Enkidu, a son of silence, woven for war. All his body was covered with fur, his hair was as long as a woman's, and his locks curled thick like ears of corn. He knew no people and no country. Enkidu's original condition may be the prototype of what is probably the most famous myth of all time, the myth of the Garden of Eden in the Hebrew Bible, in Genesis 2. And we can certainly describe Enkidu's original way of life, foraging in the wilderness alongside his animals, as Edenic. In fact, the story of his creation from clay and Anu's idea, although formed in Aruru's heart, we might also call Adamic. There are too many rabbit holes here to consider for an overview lecture, but early on in the Gilgamesh reception, at the onset of what came to be known as the Bible-Babel controversy, Delitzsch underlined that a considerable Babylonian element adheres to our religious thought through the medium of the Bible. We'll touch on just a few of the obvious contrasts here as they arise. In his creation and emergence, a bit like Gilgamesh himself, who no longer really fits in Uruk among the people, he towers over, but here a stranger to all people and nations. Adamic Enkidu is naked like an animal, living in harmony with all plant and all animal life. And weirdly, Enkidu is without human parents. Aruru simply fashions him from clay and Anu's mind. A philologist like Karl Karenyi or a philosopher like Giorgio Agamben would probably suggest that Enkidu represents what the Greeks called zoe, bare, politically unqualified, natural life, which is opposed to the qualified life of the city, the way of life of human beings in the city, for which the Greeks used the term bios, civilized life. As himself a part of wild nature, Enkidu is ruining the livelihood of a local trapper or hunter, so his first interaction with the human world is through the hunter-gatherer economy. Enkidu frees all the animals and sabotages all the traps. Before too long, however, the hunter encounters Enkidu at the waterhole, and they lock gazes. He looks like a god. Actually, Enkidu looks more like a meteorite fallen from the sky, something not from around here. The hunter's father advises him to go to King Gilgamesh and relate all he has seen. Wise father there. You could even say that it was the hunter's father who came up with the idea, which Gilgamesh agreed with, that Shamhat should be sent to tame Enkidu. The father says, "Take the road and head towards Uruk. Go, my son, and bring back a priestess of Ishtar. When the herd comes to the waterhole, make her strip and show her charms. He will see her and run to her. Then he will abandon the herd of his youth." All that Gilgamesh adds to this bright idea is to name the priestess, and he repeats the father's lines verbatim. Gilgamesh said to him, to the hunter, "Go, my hunter, and bring with you Shamhat, a priestess of Ishtar." In Old Babylonian, Shamhat was called Shamkatum, and she is a major character. Although often neglected or misrepresented, her name may mean literally in Akkadian, flourishing, luxuriant, or lush, and it will later form a pun with merriment. Calling Shamhat a harlot or fallen woman, a child of pleasure, prostitute, a courtesan, or a sex worker certainly projects modern conceptions and prejudices. The Akkadian word harimtu has no English equivalent. Yes, harimtus are sexually promiscuous in cuneiform text, but the evidence that they accepted payment for sex is slim. As Hella puts it, what we can say is that Shamhat is a wise and outspoken woman who makes conscious use of her sexual appeal, although she also accepts gifts. That Shamhat is employed or trained in Ishtar's temple makes the translation of her social role as priestess a viable option, but not without its issues. We'll explore this more later. Like in ancient Greece, harimtus, or the Greek hetaira, are liminal feminine figures who occupy exceptional positions in their social worlds. Since they are not defined by legal relation with men, whether as wives, mothers, unmarried daughters, servants, or slaves, they seem to have a measure of freedom and independence from male-governed household norms. Different positive and negative perspectives on Shamhat emerge from within the tale itself, especially later when Enkidu curses but then recants his curses, on the advice of the sun god Shamash. More on that later. The 3-day journey of Shamhat and the hunter to Enkidu's watering hole is highly condensed in the text. We can only imagine what they might have talked about. Then, 3 days of waiting at the watering hole until Enkidu shows up. Shamhat is possibly aroused by what she sees, but possibly also scared. Shamhat saw him, the man of the wild, this brute born in Wasteland's womb. The hunter says, "There he is, Shamhat. Bare your breasts and spread your legs. Work your charm, Kuzbu. Be brave and smell his scent. He will see you and run to you. Throw off your clothes and bring him down. Show this wild man what a woman can do, and his lust will wrap him around your body." Schmidt devotes a whole chapter, and Zielkowski several sections, to how translations or adaptations of this literary sex scene have varied enormously, from discretion to prurience, that is, having an itching desire. An anthology of more or less arousing, more or less successful translations of this scene could be a compilation all its own, and I bet it would sell. Helen notes that the keyword kuspu in Akkadian is a bit like the modern English mojo, magnetic sexual allure that pulls people to those who wield it. It's the word used for erotic attraction, and it's used for males too, such as when Ishtar is attracted by Gilgamesh's kusbu. Kusbu, more indirectly, is also what brings Gilgamesh and Enkidu together. The scene continues. Shamhat untied her skirt, spread her legs, and worked her charm. She was brave and smelled his scent, threw off her clothes, and brought him down. She showed the wild man what women can do, and his lust wrapped him around her body. For 6 days and 7 nights, Enkidu was aroused and made love to Shamhat. In fact, as Hella relates, a tiny fragment from the start of Tablet 2 has recently been discovered, which shows that Enkidu's marathon of sex with Shamhat lasted twice as long as previously thought, and this was the aspect that the media latched onto. The Times reported the discovery under the headline, "Ancient Sex Saga, now twice as epic." But when he had had his fill of her delights, he turned back to the herd. But the gazelles saw him and ran. The herd of the wild fled from him. So let's consider 2 things here. First, if the biblical fruit of knowledge is usually understood by theologians as a euphemistic symbol for intercourse, here we have a literal sex scene in which a man, in his natural condition, is civilized through an erotic encounter, and it is through such civilizing eros that Enkidu comes to acquire culture, knowledge, and even spoken language. Consider also, now that the Bible Babel controversy has long been reduced to a simmer, we might note that Enkidu's fall from innocence through his encounter with a hunter's traps and sex with Ishtar's priestess appears to be a prototype for Adam's fall via Eve, the serpent, and the forbidden fruit. It does turn out that Gilgamesh's plans are successful. After his long enjoyment of Shamhat's love arts, Enkidu emerges physically weakened, and his animals become bewildered and shun him forever. An important question to ask ourselves here is, why exactly do the animals shun Enkidu? Is it because they witnessed him consorting with a city woman? Do they smell or sense Shamhat's civilizing influence? The narrative doesn't say. All we know from the animal's perspective is that Enkidu's erotic encounter has placed him in a position of more or less permanent exile from their world. As the text puts it, Enkidu has sullied his spotless body. The herd was running. His knees were stuck. Enkidu was weakened and could not keep up. But now he could reason and think. This would make sex, or civilizing eros, and love arts the origin of human rationality. As Mitchell's translation puts what happens next, Enkidu turned back to Shamhat, and as he walked, he knew that his mind had somehow grown larger. He knew things now that an animal can't know. How very philosophical this series of Gilgamesh is. Human consciousness, in distinction from animality and animal consciousness, is a huge topic in the history of Western culture, literature, religion, and philosophy. Philosophers have proposed many criteria to define what separates humans from animals, and since Aristotle, they focused especially on the capacity for language or reason, and also that the human being is a political animal, zoon politikon. This seems to be the definition of humanity at issue here in the 2nd or 3rd millennium BCE. Another major criteria for what separates humanity from animality was noted by the 20th century philosopher Heidegger when he defined human mortals as those who are capable of the knowledge of death as death. On this conception, animals only perish. It is only human beings who have the consciousness of their own mortality. Do animals really lack language or politics or a knowledge of death as death? Probably not. Western philosophers have most often taken this up and promoted a kind of anthropocentric exceptionalism. Such considerations make Tablet 1 all the more fascinating. For here, and prior to language, politics, or the struggle with death, it is civilizing love or erotic culture that makes us fully human. Are we reading too much into this? Maybe, maybe not. Consider how the theme of language is introduced only after the extended sexual encounter with Shamhat, and then consider how the themes of friendship and death dominate the rest of the tale. This is how the idea of language enters into the epic. Frustrated with his exile from the animal world and uncertain of his new knowledge, Enkidu and Shamhat sit down for a conversation. In the Mitchell translation, he looked at her and he understood all the words that she was speaking to him. This translation stretches the text a bit, and Hella has only, he came back to sit at the priestess's feet. He looked at the priestess's face and heard what she had to say. The Mitchell version here is more probing, since it raises the question of whether Enkidu has learned language, a major mark of being human, merely through the physical act of eros. The symbolic interpretation here would be that the wild man, innocent in nature and unaware of death, is tamed by an eros that in turn transmits language directly. This works mythically, but not rationally. A more literal interpretation may be implied. Why not consider that part of Shamhat's cultural love arts included the incantation of erotic words? It could well be that in 7 or 14 days and nights, Shamhat had managed to teach Enkidu human language precisely through love arts. This would be, forgive the incestuous overtones here, Shamhat's mothering of Enkidu, introducing him to human consciousness, language, and world. And the only literary example I can think of to compare here is the creature Caliban in Shakespeare's Tempest. The Renaissance sorcerer and sage instructs in the art of language, but who ends up cursing language, much like Enkidu ends up cursing Shamhat. I'd much rather have Shamhat as a language instructor than Prospero. The priestess said to him, to Enkidu, "You are beautiful, Enkidu. You look like a god. Why do you roam the wild with the beasts? Come, I will take you to Uruk, the sheepfold, to the holy temple where Anu and Ishtar live, and where Gilgamesh is superb in strength." As Karen Armstrong puts this scene, Enkidu has become civilized, but this involves loss as well as gain. Enkidu has been diminished, but also has become profound. He has acquired the wisdom and refinement that will enable him to enjoy the sophisticated lifestyle of Uruk. Well, not quite yet, since Shamhat's curriculum is not yet complete. Enkidu, the god-cast wild man, is no more, but Enkidu, the civilized man and skilled dream interpreter, is only being born. He does act a bit like a wandering, impetuous child in Shamhat's charge. Hearing about Gilgamesh, superb in strength, in Uruk, Enkidu's first response is instinctual and alpha. I will be the one to challenge him, subdue him by force. I will stand in Uruk and cry out, I am the greatest, or in Mitchell, I am supreme. Later, we learn Enkidu may or may not have moral qualms, a natural or acquired sense of justice as fairness, but not here. At this point, Shamhat has Enkidu exactly where she wants him, and proceeds to instruct him about the pleasurable boons of life in the city, the best architecture, dazzling dress, thundering drums, and the best music. Every day is a festival in Uruk, not to mention ravishing priestesses, their faces full of charms and hearts full of joy, so that even old men are lured into the night. Again, in the somewhat more voyeuristic Mitchell translation there. Next up, Shamhat attempts to quell Enkidu's alpha instincts, or perhaps to shift the object of his erotic fixation by describing Gilgamesh's unsurpassable prowess and power. She mentions the gods and goddesses who love Gilgamesh and suggests that Gilgamesh's two dreams about Enkidu, as interpreted by Ninsun, Enkidu as a fallen meteorite and an invincible axe, imply that their future relationship will not be competitive. Gilgamesh says, as Shamhat recounts, I wrapped my arms around it, the meteorite, and later the axe, and loved it like a wife. Then I picked it up and set it at your feet, Ninsun's feet, and you declared it my equal. Ninsun's overall interpretation of the two dreams is clear. A strong ally is coming, a friend in the time of need, a man all muscle, the mightiest in the land. That two prophetic dreams are interpreted to Enkidu by Shamhat again suggests that she is playing the role of Enkidu's teacher. This may imply that when Enkidu later acts as a friend and advisor to Gilgamesh, and interpreter of Gilgamesh's many dreams, for better or worse, and interpreter of his own death dream, he may well be practicing the very skills he learned from the priestess of Ishtar. In short, Enkidu owes his education to Shamhat. Archetypally, this is not unrelated to the Greek philosopher Socrates, who claims in Plato's Symposium to have learned all that he knows about the nature of love from the priestess of Mantinea, Diotima, who acts in that dialogue as a kind of civilizer of Socrates. This literary analog comparing the Socrates-Diotima relation to the Enkidu-Shamhat relation might suggest that we can read Enkidu also as a kind of philosopher in this text, a lover of wisdom and of civilization, under Shamhat's loving care. Tablet 1 ends, when Shamhat had told Enkidu about Gilgamesh's dreams, the two of them began to make love again. It appears that any doubts or confusions Enkidu may still have, and his dominance instincts, are being temporarily quelled with more sex, and with this, Tablet 1 concludes. As Tablet 2 begins, we find Enkidu making love to Shamhat for that other 6 nights and 7 days, a re-education process which is described in these lines so recently discovered as a forgetting of the wild of his youth. This would make Shamhat's pedagogy probably the first literary example we have of lethic education, education not only through remembering, but also forgetting. Enkidu agrees to go to Uruk. The woman's wisdom landed in his heart, but first Shamhat tears her clothes in two and dresses Enkidu for the first time, and after she brings him to the herdsmen's huts and the pens of their sheep. The herdsman's realm functioning here as a transitional space between the wilderness and the city. The herdsmen gawk at Enkidu's godlike, Gilgamesh-like stature, and or at Shamhat's, and they serve them bread and beer. Quote, Enkidu ate no bread, but he stared and gaped. No one had taught him how to eat bread, and he did not know how to drink beer. The priestess said to him, to Enkidu, Enkidu, eat the bread, life's essence. Drink the beer, the people's pleasure. Following these instructions, Enkidu feasts on human food, devouring it in vast quantities. And it is only after feasting that the barber cuts Enkidu's hair, washes and rubs sweet oils on his skin, dresses him like a bridegroom, equipping him with a weapon, and with this, Enkidu becomes fully human. As Hela translates this moment of self-recognition, his mind unwound and he broke into song. His heart was happy and his face resplendent. Having now learned the joys and deportments of civilized life, Enkidu puts what he's learned into practice. His next task is to reverse his role vis-a-vis nature and civilization. Instead of freeing the animals from the traps, now he stays up all night, protecting the herds from wolves and lions. Meanwhile, Gilgamesh, off stage, continues to deflower virgins and crush young men, so their roles are already reversed at the start of Tablet 2. Life seems to go on like this, with Shamhat and the herdsman for some time, until Enkidu, either speaking with or taking his pleasure with Shamhat, notices a man carrying luxury provisions to a wedding feast at Uruk. The man tells Enkidu about Gilgamesh's first night rites with all the brides. When Enkidu heard this, his face went white. It's clear that Enkidu is troubled, but unclear whether his whitened face reflects a childlike sense of unfairness or is a product of his recently acquired moral education. His preparatory liminal phase nearing completion, Enkidu sets out to Uruk, with Shamhat behind him, to find and stop Gilgamesh. His first destination is the marketplace in Uruk, where the people gather around to marvel at this shorter, stouter, more wilderness-prone double image of their king. The people mention how Uruk never forgets a festival, a real party town, and how a bed was made for Ishtar, the goddess of love. That night, Gilgamesh would lie with the bride. That the goddess Ishtar is named here is likely a later innovation in the standard version, reflecting how Inanna's roles were gradually separated out as she became both Ishtar and Ishtar, the goddess of love. Enkidu's strategy at this point, and forgive the slang, is that of a cock-blocker. But then he stepped forth and stood in the street, blocking Gilgamesh's path to the wedding house. And thus begins the ultimate wrestling match of all time, which almost destroyed a town, at least making the walls quake. Gilgamesh in front of him, angry. This is all we have from lines 202 to 12. Translators fill in the blanks differently. It's unclear who won. All that's clear is that Gilgamesh ends the fight when he puts his knee to the ground, his anger dispelled. Is Gilgamesh's gesture a sign of victory or defeat? We simply don't know the customary meaning of that gesture. The text is fragmentary on what comes next, but we do read in the old Babylonian version, they kissed and became friends. Discussing a break in the text, they sat down. Mitchell's translation adds the feature of Gilgamesh's victory, and the lines, they held hands like brothers, they walked side by side, they became true friends. All that Gilgamesh declares from the lines that remain is, I have a friend, an advisor, just as I saw in my dreams. Enkidu is grateful to Shamhat for leading him to Gilgamesh, and he offers her a gift. It's not clear what this gift is or how Enkidu acquired it, nor is it clear if the gift is a kind of payment to Shamhat at the end of services rendered. Before the reader can get settled, Tablet 2 breaks off, moves on, and picks up with the two heroes at odds in their first argument or lover's quarrel of sorts, as Gilgamesh plots their journey to Humbaba's cedar forest. So I promised a more philosophical style overview of the series of Gilgamesh in this lecture. Let's start to make good on that by attempting to distill the passionate philosophy implied in tablets 1 and 2. Not only language, but also conflict are defining markers of what it means to be human. We heard from Aristotle earlier that the human being is the animal that has language, and also the political animal. It was the Greek philosopher Heraclitus who first taught that war, conflict, or struggle, the Greek polemos, is the father or king of all. The last great pre-Socratic philosopher, Empedocles, adds to Heraclitus that the other great cosmic power alongside conflict or struggle, strife, who he calls Eris, is love, philia, meaning friendship, but sometimes also eros. I find it beyond interesting that Gilgamesh, tablets 1 and 2, can be interpreted as articulating a passionate philosophy, held as phrase, which says much the same. Above all, the first 2 tablets describe the power of civilizing love, eros, the love between Shamhat and Enkidu, and the love emerging from conflict of Enkidu and Gilgamesh as what is most distinctively human, and is the human good. We could even attempt to speculate about the philosophy hermeneutically embedded in tablets 1 and 2. It consists of 2 points. 1, the human as human is defined by a culturally mediated, hierarchical, if not also hieratic, pursuit of eros, what Freud called the pleasure principle. In learning to be human, Enkidu has also adapted himself to human hierarchical social organization, with Gilgamesh as the ultimate principle of authority by which he must test himself. The hierarchical world of human authority and the hierarchy of pleasure, the higher and lower pleasures that define the human as human, also has a sacred dimension, the hieratic. But at this point in the narrative, neither Gilgamesh nor Enkidu have as yet learned to recognize the sacred as sacred. Both are divine beings, but both have taken their existence and way of life more or less for granted. It is in teaming up that they set up the grounds for a more complete exploration of the pleasure principle together. The second core philosophical principle we might extract from Tablet 2 is that friendship is the core value, which ensures that the pursuit of eros or pleasure is not inimical to the species or human collectivity. Isolated and on their own, Gilgamesh and Enkidu were both larger than life and did considerable damage to others dwelling in the human community. Enkidu bringing the hunter to despair, and Gilgamesh bringing his people to despair. Through teaming up on the journey from nature to civilization, and vice versa, Gilgamesh and Enkidu cease to be a threat, their bond serving to direct their attention outwards towards the greater social good. For example, their first quest ends up being an imperial economic endeavor designed to bring precious cedar wood into the fold of the Uruk economy. Tablet 3 thus begins with Gilgamesh meditating on the savage Humbaba, who lives in the cedar forest. Let us kill him and crush his mind. Let us destroy Humbaba in his home in the cedar forest where he lives. This is Gilgamesh's first articulation of his quest, and Enkidu hears him out nervously, replying, Humbaba has been placed in the cedar forest, the home of the Anunnaki gods, to keep the cedars safe from harm. Enlil, the storm god and king of the gods, has made him the terror of men. Gilgamesh's first argument to Enkidu in favor of the quest is an argument from life's impermanence, and it goes something like this. So long as mortals die while gods live forever, it is the exceptional mortals who must risk death in order to achieve an everlasting name. As Gilgamesh says, my friend, who has ever climbed to the skies? Only the gods live in endless sunlight, but the days of men are numbered. All that we do is nothing but wind. And there you are, afraid of death. What then is the use of your valiant might? Gilgamesh's next move is to shame Enkidu for his ignoble cowardice and hesitation. It's a no guts, no glory argument. Should Enkidu choose to let Gilgamesh fight Humbaba alone, he is a coward, pure and simple. Gilgamesh's initial reasons for the quest here might be paraphrased loosely. Look, we're going to die anyway, so why not do this really terrible thing? Worst outcome, we'll die, but nobody will call us cowards. Best outcome, we'll become eternally famous, having proven our dominance over the most sacred things that nature and the gods have to offer. These are not good reasons for acting. In narrative terms, Gilgamesh must defeat Humbaba, just as Oedipus must solve the Sphinx's riddle. Although separated by culture zones and by centuries, both protagonists, Oedipus and Gilgamesh, are full of optimism and self-assurance. They are both driven by excessive ate, a Greek word meaning hungry, ruinous recklessness, and by hubris, the Greek word meaning arrogant audacity or overweening pride. Both Oedipus and Gilgamesh are edged onwards by an unhinged yearning to achieve and to understand more than, as mortal, they could possibly bear, comprehend, or be responsible for. All attempts to dissuade Gilgamesh from his quest by Enkidu, the Council of Elders, and Ninsun, his mother, fail. Going even implies kingly negligence, since Gilgamesh won't be there to perform the New Year festival, or Akitu. Accordingly, he promises to perform it twice when he returns. Tablet 3 begins with the old counselors reluctantly giving their blessing while instructing Enkidu to walk ahead during the journey to guide and protect the king. The next reluctant blessing they must elicit is Ninsun's, Gilgamesh's divine mother. She is evidently agitated and laments, "Why, Shamash, did you burden my son with so restless a heart?" Hela points out that the reasons for the quest are fairly muddled. Roughly 6 to 8 reasons are alluded to directly or can be inferred. Humbaba must be killed because Humbaba is evil, and Shamash, the sun god, Gilgamesh's protector, hates him. Another reason, and maybe the most plausible overall, is the economic or imperialist expansionist one. Humbaba must be subdued so as to take his cedar back to Uruk. And this because cedar is necessary for good construction and doesn't grow anywhere near Uruk, while the alternative, fir wood, is of poor quality. An obvious motive, Humbaba must be killed so Gilgamesh can ensure an eternal name and eternal fame for himself. But the context makes us wonder if Gilgamesh might have less narcissistic motives as well. Enkidu has realized that he's not like the others. He's different because he lacks a family and hence without legacy. The quest to kill Humbaba might be Gilgamesh's way of cheering Enkidu up after the initial honeymoon of their friendship has worn off. Another motivation might be to slight Enlil, the king of the gods, thereby getting the gods' attention, much as Uta-napishti did with Ea's help when he escaped the flood. If the immortal Uta-napishti defied Enlil, then surely a slight against Enlil brings Gilgamesh one step closer to being like Uta-napishti, possibly a candidate for immortality. Other than the economic motive to enhance Uruk's cedar economy, probably the other most plausible motivation is simply by decree or royal resolution. The reason to go and kill Humbaba is simply, as Gilgamesh says, because my mind is made up. Literally, I have become massive, impossible to reason with. All of these reasons and more are cited or in play in the text, but no single reason wins out as sufficient. Probably to a refined philosophical commentator on Gilgamesh, if such a thing ever existed, we don't know, all these reasons played a kind of role in that relationship between mortal and divine economy, human hierarchy, and its relation to the sacred. Ninsun's response to the quest adds another layer of complexity. In her first agitated response, she washes herself 7 times in her chamber of cleansing, adorns herself and speaks to Gilgamesh from the roof of her temple, lighting a censer for Shamash, as if resigning herself to being unable to stop Gilgamesh. Her prayer to Shamash intervenes to compel the sun god's protection of Gilgamesh, ensuring his victory. But next, Ninsun blurs the distinction between internal desire and external influence, and declares that the sun god set him off in that direction. This is an interesting observation by Hela. In narrative terms, Shamash's role corresponds to the mytheme of the dispatcher king or the quest uncle. If we were to apply a little Propian analysis of folklore here, later hero quests, such as the Greek stories of Perseus, Bellerophon, or Jason, the quest uncle or dispatcher king drives the action and determines the ordeals and the task that the hero must face. Shamash, the sun god, as dispatcher king, is central to everything Gilgamesh does and accomplishes. The god is Gilgamesh's solar or titanic unconscious. And it's fascinating that the ambiguities in the text, especially the mother's response, reflects this. Later, we'll see how the standard Babylonian version of Gilgamesh may have at the core of its literary design the replacement of the cult of Ishtar in Uruk by that of the sun god Shamash. It is Shamash versus Ishtar through and through in the standard Babylonian version, but we'll get to that argument later in the lecture. Reading Ninsun's response, Hela asks, so which is it? Did Gilgamesh make up his mind, or did the god make him go? While defeating Humbaba will be Gilgamesh's greatest military success, it's also true this success is made possible only by the intervention of his mother. Not so heroic, really, that the mother is pulling all the strings of the plot behind the scenes. And this is even a bit anomalous in terms of later hero myth, where a decisive separation from the world of the mother and the mother's influence seems to be crucial to the hero's transition away from the world of the mothers and integration into the world of the fathers. Setting aside this interesting avenue for further investigation, Hela can only conclude, citing John Bailey, that the campaign against Humbaba is a natural reflex for the very male form of friendship, in which love is never fully separate from violence. What is striking about the quest is how easily the militaristic heroic ideals of the epic can be an occasion for intimate affection. These are the 7th and 8th implicit reasons for the quest. 7, male friendship must involve violence and subjugation to be recognized externally as successful. And 8, this form of male bonding shifts the object of erotic fixation away from brides, priestesses, or wives, and towards the homoerotic attraction. And so, along these lines, as Hela cites, Wall goes further. The quest against Humbaba is a type of heroic honeymoon. The couple flees the crowded city for the privacy of the wilderness, where, like Achilles and Patroclus, they sleep together in the same tent. So who is the forest guardian Humbaba, and why has he become the focal point of ecological readings of the series of Gilgamesh? For those of you who have watched Miyazaki's Spirited Away, and I hope that's everyone, you might wonder, why do this awful thing? Kill the forest guardian? No, absolutely no. This ecologically aware response may not have been atypical for Mesopotamian culture as well, and it does seem that everyone is against the plan, except for Gilgamesh himself. No hero myth can go without its monster slaying. But is Humbaba a monster? An ogre? Giant? Demon? Or what? Hela notes how Humbaba is never described directly in the text, only in metaphor. His howl is a flood, his voice is fire, his breath is death. Humbaba's realm is described sometimes as the lair of a monster, but also, and even more prominently, as the court of a king. Jan Patočka, who was one of the first philosophers to write about Gilgamesh and Atrahasis, in his heretical essays on the philosophy of history, tends to take the text too much at face value, and he identifies Humbaba, as well as Ishtar, strictly with the notion of a world evil. This misses something important. Hela suggests that it's only the uncanny rift between animals and humans, wild nature and civilized Uruk, which makes Humbaba monstrous. Indeed, the cultural world in which Gilgamesh is written is one that privileges and loves the city as a realm of order and flourishing human life, and tends to cast the wilderness far from romantically as something sublime, but more as the dangerous realm of the unknown, where human life is under constant threat from overpowering forces. While all hope is lost for the heroes in Humbaba's realm, the poem juxtaposes this fear with Humbaba's cedar forest as a, quote, rich and riotous place, full of music and aromas. Later, when the lush jungle is turned into a wasteland by reckless destruction, the poem's lamentation verges on an ecological critique. The incursions into Humbaba's realm and violence against him are portrayed in the text as sacred crimes, as is the murder of the Bull of Heaven, crimes for which the heroes will pay dearly. In both episodes, the heroes treat the natural world only in terms of what resources they can take from it. Some things are too sacred to be interfered with, commodified, or controlled, is the moral lesson here, and even, just possibly, a critique of colonial violence. Maybe Humbaba is the chieftain of the human community that live in the cedar forest, and Gilgamesh and Enkidu are conquerors and colonialists. This stretches the literary character of our text too far, but may be closer to its social truth. In any case, Gilgamesh and Enkidu repeatedly refuse to learn Humbaba's lesson until it is too late. So moving on to the journey to Humbaba and Gilgamesh's dreams, Tablet 4 narrates the journey to Humbaba, Gilgamesh's many dreams, and Enkidu's dream interpretations. An interesting aspect of this tablet is Gilgamesh's vulnerability, which can seem unheroic. Here and elsewhere, Gilgamesh is a hero who sleeps and dreams more than he fights. Enkidu's rose-tinted spectacle interpretations of Gilgamesh's horrifying, agonistic dreams are read by most as manifestly absurd. The axiom underlying Enkidu's dream logic seems to be, the worse the dream, the better the omen and outcome. But it could be that Enkidu begins his downward spiral here by acting the part of an incompetent counselor, one who tells the king only what he wants to hear. The dream realm has always been ambiguous, paradoxical, and irrational. Are we reading too anachronistically as modern rational subjects who want everything, even dreams, to make sense when we expect Enkidu's dream interpretations to resolve all dream ambiguities? Understanding Gilgamesh's dreams in terms of Freudian repression and ego defenses, and Enkidu's interpretations in terms of wish fulfillment fantasies certainly has its appeal to modern readers. But it's also possible that Enkidu is a skilled dream interpreter in his cultural context, whether by nature or instruction. And certainly, Tablet 4 is of interest to anyone interested in ancient Oneiromancy, the Greek word for dream divination. The validity or not of Enkidu's dream divinations is not obvious. Oneiromancy has never or will ever be an exact science. On the one hand, bad dreams imply that what the heroes have set out to do goes against the edicts of the gods and the order of nature. But on the other, and perhaps plausibly in each dream, Enkidu finds a Shamash figure who shows up to ensure victory. Hella remarks how Mesopotamian dreams are like knots to be untied. The Akkadian word for interpret, pasaru, literally means to unknot. Dreams play a major role, at least 4 times in the epic, in tablets 1, 4, 7, and 11. This topic lends itself to a longer treatment, so I'll pass over it here. The heroes are traveling quickly to the east, getting closer to Mount Lebanon. Tablet 5 begins at their destination and narrates the encounter with Humbaba. They gazed on the cedar mountain, home of the gods, throne of goddesses. Sumptuous cedars grew along the mountainside and cast their pleasant, joyful shades. But here, as on the journey to the cedar forest, Gilgamesh begins to doubt, tremble, and weep. It is Enkidu who is more resolved. Let your heart speak war, forget death, chase life. Has Enkidu failed in his role as advisor again? Humbaba mentions this possibility in his first words to the heroes, quote, "Fools will take advice from half-wits. Gilgamesh, what is it you want here? And you, Enkidu, fish that never knew its father, turtle spawn that never drank its mother's milk. I watched you when you were young, but I let you be. Why did you lead that evil Gilgamesh to me?" Passing over what more we learn about Enkidu here, the picture of Humbaba that emerges from Tablet 5 is multifaceted. Although a nebulous shapeshifter, metamorphosis is always a kind of monstration. As I read Humbaba, he is far from pure evil. In fact, he considers Gilgamesh to be the evil. Gilgamesh again loses resolve, and Enkidu rouses their battle fury. Lines of the battle scene are lost, but eventually, when white clouds turned black and death fell like a fog, Shamash, honoring the prayer of Ninsun, Gilgamesh's mother, turns up to unleash his mighty storms, or 13 winds, pinning Humbaba. Darkness fell on the face of Humbaba. He could not ram ahead, he could not kick back, and Gilgamesh's weapons brought him down. Previously full of bravado and smack talk, thundering, splitting mountains, casting up sulphurous fogs, Humbaba begs for mercy, pathetically, a tameable evil. In the Mitchell translation, he says, "If you spare my life, I will be your slave. I will give you as many cedars as you wish. You are king of Uruk by the grace of Shamash. Honor him with a cedar temple and a glorious cedar palace for yourself. All this is yours, if only you spare me." This is a great offer, no? And many would consider the core of rationality to be the consideration of mutual benefit. But Enkidu, as advisor, assumes it must be a trick and dissuades Gilgamesh from even considering the offer. My friend, do not listen to him. The tablet breaks off, but Mitchell fills in. Dear friend, don't listen to anything the monster says. Kill him before you become confused. Humbaba turns to plead with Enkidu, reminding him that he is a child of the forest, who knows the mind of the forest, like himself. But Enkidu is unmoved. Destroy him, kill him, crush his mind. To modern ears, this could be read as a scene of colonial violence or genocide. Instead of teaming up with the order of nature and the gods, the heroes subjugate and kill. It could also be that Humbaba really is brutal and a kind of world evil. His smack talk scenes are certainly pretty menacing, but I prefer to read Humbaba as the victim here. It was this identification that began in the 70s and 80s more ecological interpretations of the epic, such as here on the left, Anselm Kiefer's 1980s photographic series, which portrays the sacred spirit and lament of the cedar forest and signals the emergence of ecological themes into the modern Gilgamesh reception. Ecological interpreters of ancient myth tend to point out how most all heroes are considered more closely also anti-heroes, and contrawise, many a mythical monster, Humbaba or the Sphinx, for example, are in fact the unheeded voice of nature and of nature's reason. Much of the text is lost, but in bargaining, Humbaba is at times tender, weeping, even beneficent. He astutely proposes a productive economic alliance with Gilgamesh, but to no avail. In the Sumerian Huwawa A tablet, this scene is depicted more as a battle of wits than of might, and Huwawa is depicted as gullible and lonely, since he is tricked into believing that Gilgamesh's offer of treasure, wives, and concubines is sincere. In these Sumerian versions, Humbaba's 7 cloaks of dread are more like glories, glamours, or auras, and one of them stuns the heroes into unconsciousness, a bit like the spirit Ariel putting the Milanese court to sleep in Shakespeare's The Tempest, or the Fae doing much the same in A Midsummer's Night Dream. In all versions, the heroes do not trust nature's beautiful might or terrifying radiance, and so Humbaba's last words are a prophetic curse against them. May they not grow old together. May Enkidu have no one but Gilgamesh to bury him. Gilgamesh cuts the neck and severs the head of Humbaba, heedless of the sacrilege, and then Enkidu carves Humbaba up and tears off his tusks. It is these gruesome acts that separate them from nature and curse them both with respect to the divine order of things. Hauntingly, in Mitchell's translation, after this cataclysm, a gentle rain fell onto the mountains. All we read in the actual tablet is, fell on the mountains, but most translators, including George, infer rain. Today, there are only a few patches of cedar forest left in Lebanon. The actions of Gilgamesh and Enkidu have become a kind of mythic cipher of human-caused devastation, and a bleak reminder that we have not learned the lessons of our very first stories. And we can compare here Nietzsche's prophecy in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, the wasteland grows. Woe to those who find wastelands within. Enkidu is certainly one born of wasteland's womb, or a child of silence, who carries within himself the cause of his own annihilation. He was formed by Aruru, a stranger in a strange land, to have a storm in his heart equal to the storm in Gilgamesh's heart. And it is environmental devastation and the curse of Humbaba which seems to be the result. Almost immediately, as they gather resin from the cedars for incense to appease Enlil, the heroes recognize and lament their wrongdoing. My friend, we have turned the forest into wasteland. What will we say if Enlil asks us in Nippur, "You used your strength to kill the guardian. What wrath sent you trampling through the forest?" But they continue to devastate the forest regardless. Their axes weighed 120 pounds each, and each of their blows struck 6 feet deep. Gilgamesh cut down the trees, while Enkidu found the best timber. Enkidu worked his words, saying to Gilgamesh, My friend, we have felled a mighty cedar whose topmost branches touched the skies. This could well be another biblical prototype image for the Tower of Babel. Here, a world tree that the heroes will carve into a door 120 feet high and set into the Euphrates River to carry it to Enlil's temple in Nippur as a peace offering. As we'll learn later and already know, such atonement is impossible. And Tablet 5 ends a bit somberly, perhaps with only a hint of joy. They gathered branches of cedar, cypress, and juniper and made a raft, loading it with. Enkidu sailed on the raft, and Gilgamesh sailed on the head of Humbaba. Moving along to Tablet 6. It's an intriguing or awful tablet, depending how we understand it. To be sure, the misogyny expressed in this tablet and in Enkidu's curses against Shamhat in Tablet 7 can be upsetting or exhilarating to contemporary readers. This is Ziolkowski's cultural seismograph in action. Misogyny in the epic certainly raised less eyebrows throughout the 19th and early 20th century Gilgamesh reception. For example, reading the figure of Ishtar as a matriarch temptress led Carl Jung to understand the epic in terms of unconscious incestuous desire for the uterine mother versus the heroic masculine individuation process. Even earlier, in the first literary adaptation, Hamilton's 1884 Ishtar and Izdubar, Izdubar being the best guess for Gilgamesh's name at that time, the noble Izdubar rejects Ishtar's advances indignantly. Quote, "What meanest thou, thou wanton brazen thing? Wouldst thou on me the direst curses bring?" At this early date, Hamilton turns the tragedy into a love song, somewhat on the model of Fitzgerald's Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, which was popular at the time. The schism of Izdubar and Ishtar will be reconciled. Ishtar will bring light and love back to the world, and Izdubar will enjoy eternal bliss among the immortals with the seer's daughter, Mua, a tidy solution. Today, in 2024, when students read Book 6, they walk on landmines. Some even blame me for assigning Gilgamesh. One student dropped out of the course, and others disturbingly approve of Gilgamesh's diatribe without reserve, asking about Ishtar, didn't she have it coming? My own non-expert sense is that Tablet 6 reflects a gradual transition in mythic values associated with gender and the divine feminine in Mesopotamian culture, from the Sumerian to the Akkadian and later Assyrian periods, namely a decline from respect for the goddess to denigration. Although Tablet 6 was written in a time when patriarchal values had achieved absolute ascendancy, it can also be read as a subtle vindication of Ishtar's claim against Gilgamesh and the form of kingship he represents. It begins with the heroes arriving home, dirty and triumphant. Gilgamesh cleans up, puts on his royal crown, and Ishtar catches sight of his beauty and makes a not-so-subtle pass at him. This is both similar and not similar to the Inana of personal agency and conscious circumspection that we met in Inanna's myth cycle. Some features are related, such as Ishtar's ability to use feminine potency to accomplish her intent. But the Ishtar we meet in Tablet 6 is petty and vengeful in comparison to her Sumerian counterpart. The situation strikes me as not unlike the transition in Greek mythology from archaic Greek to later Roman representations of goddesses. Here are Ishtar's first direct words in the standard version. "Come, Gilgamesh, marry me. Give me the fruit of your body. Be my husband, make me your wife. Let me ready for you a chariot of lapis lazuli and gold, with golden wheels and caps of amber, drawn by demons, big mules indeed. Step into my cedar-scented house, and as you step into my house, the threshold and throne will kiss your feet." The goddess goes on, "Kings, lords, and nobles will bow down before you and bring you tribute from mountains and plains, while the goats bear you triplets and your ewes twins. Your donkey will be the fastest with its freight, your horse will gain glory in the chariot, your ox will be unmatched at the plow." It seems to me that only a fool or a bad king would refuse such a sweet offer from the goddess of his hometown. Gilgamesh is being honored beyond reckoning, so what accounts for his scathing reply? Hella suggests that nowhere is Gilgamesh's self-destructive character clearer than in his rejection of Ishtar. Why does he turn down her offer of marriage? Surely, the insatiable hero must have been tempted by the goddess of sex. Scholars have proposed various reasons for the rejection, but what is striking about it is the spite with which it is delivered. Even if Gilgamesh had good reasons to decline Ishtar's offer, it was hardly a tactful way to do so. Gilgamesh's reply is not only tactless and spiteful, it is sacrilegious. Gilgamesh is the greatest king of Uruk since Enmerkar or Lugalbanda, his two predecessors, and Ishtar is the goddess of Uruk, the most important goddess of his culture. In fact, the proposal of an alliance or sacred marriage of Gilgamesh and Ishtar only makes cultural sense. Marrying Ishtar is simply one of Gilgamesh's social responsibilities. Again, in my non-expert view, the verbiage that Gilgamesh uses in his rejection would have been unthinkable to an earlier cultural mindset, which is maybe why the Sumerian versions, while exploring a conflict between Gilgamesh and Ishtar, lack the vitriol. In the standard version, Gilgamesh worked his words, saying to Ishtar, "As if I would ever marry you. Who would wash my clothes and body? Who would give me food and fare? Would you serve me bread that is fit for a god? Would you pour me beer that is fit for a king?" The litany of invective that follows is not worth quoting. It may feel candid and direct, depending on your relationship history seismograph, but it's overkill and goes on too long, a sure sign that here misogyny reigns untethered. A bad winter, a broken door, a crumbling palace, an untamed elephant, a lump of pitch, a weak block, a leaky flask, a destructive ram, a shoe that hurts your foot. This is only the beginning. Wake up, readers. Nobody deserves this degree of spite, insult, and humiliation. Certainly not a divine goddess. Gilgamesh goes on to recount the mythic history of Ishtar's many failed relationships. Tell me, did any of your lovers last? Did any of your lovebirds fly to the skies? Come, let me count out your conquests. There was Tammuz, Dumuzi, who damned to underworld sorrow year after year, the roller bird, the lion, and the stallion, doomed to servitude, incarceration, and death. The shepherd turned into a wolf, a reversal of roles, and a proto-version of the Actian myth. And then the innocent gardener, Ishulanu, who always brought you dates in his basket, and every day set for you a sparkling table, who you offered yourself to, and who slandered you, and who you turned into a garden pest, the weevil in Hella's translation. In the Mitchell version, Ishulanu is seduced with the offer of fellatio, but after he gives in, he's turned into a doomed toad in a devastated garden. Even the translators can't resist getting in on the misogynistic action here. Gilgamesh's question, "And now you would love me and treat me the same?" Revealing my own seismograph here, only members of a misogynistic and patriarchal society could possibly applaud Gilgamesh's savage burns. Feels like truth to some, but it's sort of incel, no? As we saw in the Inana lecture, the Sumerian tablets of Gilgamesh offer a different vision. In the Huluputri tale, Gilgamesh acts as a deeply supportive and helpful brother to Inanna. And in the Sumerian version of the Bull of Heaven story, yes, Gilgamesh rejects Inanna's marriage proposal, but he does not insult her so vituperatively. He only asks for freedom from traditional kingly marriage to Inanna, and he attempts to make amends. In the George translation, he says to her, "O Lady Inanna, you must not block my path. Let me catch wild bulls in the mountains. Let me fill your folds. Let me catch sheep in the mountains. Let me fill your pens. Let me pile silver, carnelian, lapis lazuli, and trinkets in leather bags. Let me fill your house." My sense is that Tablet 6 of the SBV, even Ishtar's temper tantrum in the Old Babylonian version, reflects a gradual modification of the culture zone towards repudiation of the goddess. Nonetheless, the old Babylonian and later Assyrian storytellers did not lose sight of the cultural differences, as we moderns tend to do. The standard version seems acutely aware that however righteous Gilgamesh is in rejecting Ishtar in their context, it is Ishtar's claim, even in the midst of her manipulative screaming, which holds sway in the Sumerian context they recount. In the standard version, Ishtar, furious, arrives at Anu's house to cry and pout, and the first thing Anu says to her we might call slut-shaming. Quote, "Ah, but did you not goad King Gilgamesh into spouting slander about you, and insults against you?" Jenny Lewis developed and shaped the Inana Ishtar narrative in Tablet 6 more through a feminist lens. In her Gilgamesh Retold translation and doctoral dissertation, instead of going to Anu, Lewis has Inanna respond directly to Gilgamesh. Inanna's eyes grew cold as slate, her growl of rage a thunderous belch. The veins of her neck stood out like vines. She spat words like a hail of spears. Reminding Gilgamesh that he is only 2/3 divine, she promises retaliation against the part of you that's human, a brilliant interpretation, considering that's exactly what happens. In parallel to Inanna's descent, Lewis's next move is to expand upon Inanna's ascent to Anu's heaven in 7 stages parallel to the descent. This time, Inanna chooses to discard her holy May, so she can travel faster than any wind. She arrives at Anu's temple, naked yet resplendent. Rather than insinuate his daughter is to blame, the father of the gods tries to talk her out of releasing the bull of heaven, but he desists when she utters her famous threat. Quote from the Lewis, "I'll open the gates of hell and wake the dead. I'll set them free to eat the living. There'll be no soul left on earth." This seems to be the first threat of zombies destroying all life in ancient literature. Anu quickly realizes he could not argue with his rampant eldest daughter. The standard version of Ishtar's threat in the Hella translation reads, "If you do not give me the bull of heaven, I will raise all the houses of the underworld and open the gates to the land below. I will raise the dead to eat the living. The living will be outnumbered by the dead." Earlier generations of translators have often inserted and reworked the myth of Inanna's descent here, as if Gilgamesh's spiteful spurn is sufficient reason for a goddess descending to her death. However, in the descent myth, Inanna states her reason for descending as that of attending the funeral of the Bull of Heaven, which may suggest reconciliation with Ereshkigal after the fact. In any case, during the zombie threat in Tablet 6, Inanna speaks as if she already wields the power to descend, to open the gates of the underworld. The mythic details seem to be a bit blurred, even to the author of the standard version. Anu first checks that Inanna has collected sufficient storehouse resources to endure the ensuing famine, lasting 7 years, and Ishtar confirms that she has, at which Anu relents. Hella points out that in the old and standard Babylonian version, Ishtar Inanna is especially complex and unpredictable, associated with sex, destruction, paradox, and transformation. It's also possible that Ishtar is framed across the standard version in political antithesis to Shamash, the sun god and Gilgamesh's personal protector. But there is a limit to Shamash's power to protect Gilgamesh, and by spurning Ishtar and killing the Bull of Heaven, Gilgamesh has crossed the line. After they had killed the Bull of Heaven, they cut out its heart and gave it to the sun god. They stepped back and bowed before Shamash. Then the two of them sat down together. Ishtar went up to the wall of Uruk, stamped her feet in anger, and cried, "Woe to Gilgamesh, who disgraced me and killed the Bull of Heaven." As Hella points out, Ishtar's wish comes true the very next day, as Enkidu wakes up from his nightmare and knows that he will die. With just 2 words, "Alu, Gilgamesh," Ishtar has turned the epic around, from glory to gloom, from triumph to sorrow. While the women carry out a ritual lamentation for the Bull of Heaven, the men throw a party. Ishtar begins the lamentation as Gilgamesh begins the celebration. Going their different directions in this way, is a clear sign that harmony in the city of Uruk is no more. The reason why it is Enkidu that must die and not Gilgamesh has been much pondered. Freud and Jung's correspondence on Gilgamesh concerns this point. For Freud, Enkidu, who he still calls Eabani, is like Sancho Panza to Don Quixote, or Castor to Pollux in the Dioscuri myth, or Remus to Romulus at the origin of Roman myth. Enkidu is the weaker twin, sidekick, placenta, or afterbirth of the God-man, and the one who always dies sooner. Jung picks up this theme in his symbols of transformation, understanding Enkidu as instinctual unconscious, also Humbaba and Ishtar, a lower man or the shadow of Gilgamesh. Less profoundly, there are at least two textual reasons why Enkidu must die and not Gilgamesh. One, Enkidu's death strikes Gilgamesh where it hurts. The only place it can hurt is mortal's side, thus creating an incipit for his adventure to Uta-napishti. And two, it was Enkidu who tore off the bull's member, hurling it at Ishtar, and who also egged Gilgamesh on to kill Humbaba. In summing up Tablet 6, Hela concludes, the degree to which Gilgamesh mismanages Uruk's relationship with Ishtar makes it the most egregious of his royal crimes. In Tablet 6, not only does Gilgamesh fail to pay homage, he endangers the entire city, once again acting the part of an irresponsible ruler. Crucially, it is Ishtar standing on the wall of Uruk when she declares her curse on Gilgamesh. In the text preserved, the wall makes only 3 appearances in the story. It is mentioned in the prologue, it is mentioned at the end, and it is mentioned here, at the turning point of Tablet 6. The ancient takeaway from Tablets 3 to 6 went a bit like this. The humanizing value of friendship, while it protects the human community from outlier demigods like Gilgamesh and Enkidu, also lays siege to and undermines the world of the gods. And a modern takeaway from Tablet 6 might be, even the sacred powers of love, sexuality, and fertility are susceptible of being undermined when masculinist models of subjective power go unchecked. Tablet 6 ends when the young men went to sleep in their beds. Enkidu, too, went to bed and had a dream. Hela aptly calls this the ancient equivalent of an end-of-season cliffhanger, and with that, Tablet 6 ends. Tablet 7 is Gilgamesh's incipit tragodia. The tragedy begins with Enkidu's dream of the Council of the Gods, where Anu, Enlil, Ea, or Enki discuss the punishment to be meted out for the bull's murder. And Enlil said, Enkidu will die, but Gilgamesh will not die, in the Hittite prose version. In the standard version, Enkidu tries to remind Enlil of the 120-foot tree door, a Babylonian kind of gateway between heaven and earth, that he had gifted to Enlil's temple in Nippur, but to no avail. Enkidu even suggests that had he known of Enlil's verdict, he would have smashed his greatest temple and installed the sun god Shamash in Enlil's place. Here Enkidu sounds more than a bit like Humbaba sounded earlier, wishing he'd committed a preemptive act of violence. Humbaba wishes that he had killed Enkidu when he was wandering as a cub in the wilderness, and Enkidu, in his hubris, now wishes that he had eradicated Enlil's worship on the earth. Gilgamesh listened to Enkidu's words, and soon his tears began to drop. He doesn't accept Enkidu's dream and attempts to spin a more positive outcome. Roles reversed again, and he says, grief is left to the living. The dead leave, the living grieve. Next, he prays, pleads, and supplicates, the bargaining phase. But Enkidu isn't having it. No, my friend, my fate is carved. Some people die before their time. Next up, and in a raving state, are Enkidu's curses on Shamhat and the hunter, which is the second grossly misogynistic and anti-civilization diatribe in the standard version. Enkidu says, come, Shamhat, I will fix a fate for you, a fate that will last forever. A mighty curse I will on you, may it catch you straight away. Shamhat will be childless and homeless, abused by drunks, without finery and feasts. Her love nest will be a doorway or a highway crossing, her bed in ruins. Her feet will be damaged by thorns and spines, since she'll have no money for shoes, and her roof will be leaky, and her thighs sullied. The portrait Enkidu paints of Shamhat's dark fate is that of a common prostitute, not a respected priestess of Ishtar. It shows us the all-too-familiar, inhumane and traumatic aspects of Shamhat's world, and the plight of women who must endure the realities of sex work, either willingly or unwillingly. Here, only once in the poem, Shamhat is portrayed as what moderns might recognize as a sexual abuse survivor. Her position is radically de-idealized. However disgusting Enkidu's curses, the reality or possible outcome they point to in the culture is sobering. Enkidu's motivation is even more disturbing. All these curses on Shamhat, quote, "because you weakened my untouched body you weakened in the wild." This is all pretty appalling, but in the reversal from curse to blessing, the scribal authors do appear to be aware of two things. One, sickness can make people say terrible things, and two, Enkidu owes a lot to Shamhat. It is the god Shamash, Gilgamesh's and Enkidu's personal protector, who calls Enkidu out. With a booming, warning voice from the sky, the god reminds Enkidu of the good Shamash did for him, above all, civilizing him and bringing him his greatest life-defining friend. At this, Enkidu's angry, furious heart finds peace, a reconciliation with his death and fate, and his blessings on Shamhat match or exceed in splendor the miseries in each curse. Now Shamhat will be loved by lords and governors. Men will admire and desire her from 6 to 12 miles away. Soldiers will all desire her and give her rich gifts. Ishtar will lead her to the wealthiest of friends. Husbands will leave their wives for her on command. As much as the blessings do outweigh the curses, the picture of Shamhat we receive from Enkidu's two speeches problematize any sex-positive desire to see in Shamhat only a priestess. In both speeches, Shamhat is being objectified as a seductive sex object, and not much else. However sacred her love arts, from the cult of the goddess Ishtar and other abilities, she is still being depicted as a force of erotic temptation that weakened and sullied Enkidu. Hella is correct that the double judgment against Shamhat reveals how storytelling shapes the way we make sense of our lives and make judgments about others. Yes, Shamhat is wise, displays personal power and agency, but the fact that her two fates or outcomes are circumscribed, even flipped, so casually by Enkidu undermines her agency. It is up to contemporary critical theory and discussion to re-envision Shamhat's possibilities. It is only after his blessings and curses of Shamhat that Enkidu relates his dream to Gilgamesh. In his death trance, Enkidu declares to Gilgamesh, "Save me, my friend." In the dream, he is being torn between heaven and earth. The sky screams, and the earth calls back. Enkidu is caught in the middle. His near-death raving is liminal, not liminoid. He is en route, betwixt and between. A symbolic figure emerges in Enkidu's dream, perhaps a netherworld escort, or the very embodiment of death. There was a dark-faced man. His head was like a thunderbird. His hands were like lion paws. His nails were like eagle claws. He grabbed my hair and broke my strength. I knocked him down, but he sprang back like a sling. He knocked me down, and I keeled over like a raft. Like a fierce oryx, he crushed me underfoot. Break in the text, poison in my body. Enkidu asks Gilgamesh to save him, but Gilgamesh is scared. The text breaks off. Does the dream suggest deprojection or disillusionment with Gilgamesh's salvific ability? Enkidu turns into a dove and is carried helpless to the house of darkness. He is conducted to the house that no one leaves, to the road of no return, the home of those who long for light, who eat dust and live on clay. After Enkidu's description of the underworld, the tablet breaks off, picks up Enkidu to Gilgamesh. "Me, who went through every danger with you. Remember me, my friend. Do not forget what I went through. These lines have the structure of a bequest, and they set up the events to follow. The tablet zooms out at this point to describe a number of days during which Enkidu lay dying, unconscious or raving, Gilgamesh powerless to change his fate. Many lines are lost, and readers can only fill in the gaps and imagine. As Hella points out, the last section of Tablet 7 is missing, as if to spare us the pain of witnessing Enkidu's death, or perhaps to give him a last moment of privacy, like a nurse pulling the curtain to hide a dying man. The intensity of Gilgamesh's grief over Enkidu's death, like the intensity of his love, are innovations of the Akkadian version. In the Sumerian versions, Enkidu appears to be more of a favored servant, and his death lacks this pivotal meaning. It does not initiate Gilgamesh's journey beyond. But in the Akkadian versions, Gilgamesh is utterly shattered by the tragedy of Enkidu's death. If Enkidu can die like this, of what good is mortal life? As Andrew George summarizes Tablet 8, an opulent funeral is the desideratum for any great death in Near Eastern literature. Gilgamesh offers up a great lament for Enkidu. He summons his craftsmen and makes a funerary statue of his friend, and from his treasury he selects the grave goods that Enkidu will take to the netherworld to win the goodwill of the deities who dwell there. As part of the wake, a great banquet is held, and then treasures are offered to the gods of the netherworld and ritually displayed in public. Gilgamesh even makes an offering to Ishtar for Enkidu's soul and retinue below, although the purpose of atonement is unstated. We'll skip in-depth coverage of Tablet 8, but for those with the Penguin edition, note how the standard versions of Tablets 7 to 8, which narrate Enkidu's dream, death, and funeral, differ significantly from the Sumerian death of Gilgamesh. It is Gilgamesh who lies dreaming, sick and delirious on his sickbed, while Enki or Ea gives Gilgamesh a vision of the council of Inana gods, who have convened to deliberate his case for immortality. The gods first provide a life review of Gilgamesh's exploits, presumably in his old age, which makes the Sumerian tablet a more conventional, even satisfying overall conclusion to the series for some readers, but the verdict is similar. While Gilgamesh is the son of a goddess, the deification of the ancestor Uta-napishti was an exception, a one-off solution to a one-off event. Gilgamesh must descend to the netherworld like anyone else, but he will have a high rank there as ruler and judge of the dead, like Dumuzi, and he will be reunited with Enkidu, becoming a lesser deity worshipped by the dead and the living in games. Next, Gilgamesh sets to work building his own tomb and presenting gifts to the many deities of Ereshkigal's court. The stone tomb is built into the bed of the Euphrates River, and into it he will take harem and entourage to accompany him into the afterlife. This is the literary context and evidence for the now archaeologically attested practice of mass interment of whole elite households. Scholars agree that the death of Gilgamesh is a source for Gilgamesh's prayers to specific deities and the building of Enkidu's tomb in Tablet 8. In the Sumerian version, he is doing it for his own soul, but in the standard version, it is for Enkidu's soul. Easy to miss, but as Hella points out, Gilgamesh begins his eulogy in Tablet 8 by crying Enkidu. It is the first time he speaks his friend's name, and the first word he speaks after Enkidu's death. Hella continues, Gilgamesh is utterly undone by his grief. In Enkidu, he had lost both a friend and a part of himself. Who is Gilgamesh outside of that union? The relation with Enkidu transformed who he was, and now he must find out who he is without him. Above all, Gilgamesh realizes, I too will die. Am I not like Enkidu? From this, it appears that Gilgamesh's search for immortality is not only for himself, for narcissistic reasons, but it is the way that he mourns and copes, and continues to live after loss. Hella asks, what part of our being survives the loss of a loved one? Having lost Enkidu, Gilgamesh is both animalized and divinized. As his identity crumbles in Enkidu's wake, he becomes less of a man in several ways. First, he becomes more of an animal. He leaves Uruk behind and travels into the wilderness, the land of wild beasts. He eats their flesh and wears their skin. In Tablet 10, he is asked why he is dressed as a lion. Enkidu moved from nature and the steppes towards civilization and the city in Tablets 1 to 2, but at this point, Gilgamesh moves in the opposite direction, towards Enkidu, a fitting way to honor his memory. In addition, Gilgamesh tries to become more of a god. His ambitions go from heroic to divine. Gilgamesh no longer seeks only eternal fame, he now also seeks eternal life. And with this, Gilgamesh's mourning for the death of Enkidu has turned into his personal quest for immortality. Tablet 8 breaks off with, "At the first flood of daylight, Gilgamesh opened the city gate. He adorned and offered in the sun." And Tablet 9 begins, "As he wandered through the wild, Gilgamesh wept bitterly for his friend Enkidu. Grief has stepped into my heart." As happens only rarely, Gilgamesh speaks for himself here, in the first person. He says, "Afraid of death, I wander through the wild towards Uta-napishti, son of Ubaratutu. I have taken the road, I walk it fast." It is Uta-napishti, also known as Atrahasis, whose secret Gilgamesh covets. There are at least two secrets here: the secret of immortality itself, and the secret knowledge that existed among mortals before the flood. We are not certain in what exact direction Gilgamesh sets out. In this introduction, Hela suggests Gilgamesh's journey to Humbaba's forest moved to the east, whereas his journey for immortality lies to the west. But in his epilogue essay, Study the Brickwork, Hela contradicts this geographical framework. Gilgamesh's first travels west to the cedar forest, then east to reach the garden of jeweled trees. A footnote clarifies that the cartography employed in Gilgamesh is neither clear nor modern, and thus not easy to sort out. Yes, Gilgamesh journeys towards sunrise in his journey to Uta-napishti, but confusingly, the sun god seems both to set and rise through the same gate, muddying the picture. After waking from a dream in which a lion blocks his mountain pass, Gilgamesh prays to Sin, the moon god, lamp of the gods, and then he awakes, happy to be alive, and slays the actual lions that threaten him. This, Shamhat looks down and is worried. He bent down and said to Gilgamesh, "Gilgamesh, where are you going? You will not find the life you seek." Gilgamesh said to him, to Shamash the hero, "After I have walked and wandered the wild, will I lack rest in the underworld? All those years of lying down, now my eyes will see the sun till I am full of light. The dark of death is far away. Look at all the sun. When do the dead ever see daylight?" Beautiful lines from the Old Babylonian, which sound like a more tragic and somber version of Zarathustra's opening speech in Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And with this, it seems that Gilgamesh gets Shamash back on side. This is also the most on-the-road sounding statement in the Gilgamesh series, and probably the reason why beatnik poet Gregory Corso called Gilgamesh Proto-Jack Kerouac and Enkidu Proto-Neil Cassidy, two friends in search of the mystery of everlasting life. Earlier, Gilgamesh was on the road with Enkidu, more expeditiously, towards the cedar forest. Now, Gilgamesh is on the road again, but alone, meandering even, except for the visions that guide him. We don't know much about Gilgamesh's wanderings, but of his first directive destination we hear, "To Mashu's twin mountains he came, which daily guard the rising sun, whose tops support the fabric of heaven, whose base reaches down to the netherworld." Hela translates, in homage to the David Lynch TV series, the name of the mountains was Twin Peaks. He reached the twin peaks that guard the rising sun each day, peaks whose tops touch the firmament, whose roots reach down to the netherworld. The gate was guarded by scorpion people, whose visage was dread, whose eyes were death, and whose frightful light engulfed the mountains. They guard the sun when it rises and sets. Scorpion Man's wife seems more perceptive. He underlines that Gilgamesh is of god flesh, but she notices that Gilgamesh is only 2/3 divine, 1/3 human. He calls out to Gilgamesh, asking him the how and the why of his presence. "I want to know your reason for coming here." Some lines are missing, but Gilgamesh answers, "I seek the way to my ancestor, Uta-napishti, who found eternal life in the gathering of gods. He will tell me the secret of life and death." Scorpion Man's reply is fragmentary, but we do hear of a 24-hour passage, the tunnel of darkness through the mountain, in a darkness totally dense and void of light. And we also hear of a sunset and a sunrise, delimiting the time set for the journey, lest the sun incinerate Gilgamesh. As a Tolkien child growing up in the 1980s, these passages evoke fond reminiscences of the Fellowship's journey through the darksome passages of the orc-infested mines of Moria. As Hela describes this scene, the gate is a symbolic threshold in all sorts of ways, between humans and gods, night and day, light and darkness, and the mountains themselves reach up to the heavens and down to the underworld. Who better to guard this gate than two creatures who are themselves a mix of beings, half human and half animal, skipping the journey itself through the tunnel of darkness, which has to be reconstructed. After 24 hours of darkness, Gilgamesh walked out into the sun. Full of light, he went straight to look at the trees of the gods. One tree bore fruits of carnelian. It was laden with grapes and lovely to look at. Another tree bore leaves of lapis lazuli. It was blooming and beautiful to see. This is all we have for the scene of the Garden of Jeweled Trees, but it's deeply significant for the narrative. As Hela points out, towards the end of his story, Gilgamesh steps out, dazzled by the light, after many miles of darkness, into the Garden of the Gods, and here grow the most curious trees. The parallel here with Plato's myth of the cave and the ascent outside the cave into the dazzling splendor of the world of the forms is hard to miss. The realm that Gilgamesh has entered is strange indeed, and Hela continues. On the branches of these trees hang precious stones, leaves of lapis lazuli, grapes of carnelian, thorns of crystal. Gilgamesh wanders among them, bewildered by their splendor. In disbelief, he reaches out to touch a carob, finding it made of agate and hematite. Then the epic becomes fragmentary, as it so often does. When it is again readable, our hero has moved on, relentless in his pursuit of what he hopes to find beyond the garden, immortality. Keith Dixon asks, probingly and quoted in Hela, "What is this strange garden? How is such fruit grown? From what seeds? By what weird agronomy? And perhaps most important of all, what kind of being can pluck and eat and somehow incorporate this jeweled stuff into the stuff of his own flesh? Maybe the stoneman who might row Urshanabi's boat." But these questions put me in mind of the rock eater in Michael Enda's Never-Ending Story. The world into which Gilgamesh has entered does somewhat resemble Fantasia. Another brilliant observation by Dixon on this scene: Gilgamesh unfolds within the space between two trees, and Hela expands. At either end of the epic's world stands a forest. The forest of Humbaba is the noisy, aromatic, and tangled land of animals. The Garden of Jeweled Trees is the silent, luminous, and everlasting land of the gods. Between them stands Uruk, land of humans. Humans live in this in-between state. They are not gods, but they are not gods in a way that is not animal either. Unlike gods, humans are mortals. Unlike animals, they are aware of their mortality. To be human is to inhabit this mirror room of double differences. Gilgamesh may even unfold in the space between three trees, if we include the Hulupu tree, which grows in Ishtar's garden in Uruk at the outset of Tablet 12. Tablet 9 ends as Gilgamesh walked around and gaped. Then she looked up and saw him, Shiduri. Another end-of-episode cliffhanger as Tablet 10 picks up with Gilgamesh's encounter with Shiduri, the innkeeper. And we might begin to put together at this point just how important female protagonists are to the pivots in the narrative. After Ninsun, Shamhat, Ishtar, and the Scorpion Man's wife, Shiduri is the next crucially important, liminal or divine female protagonist in the series. And the last will be Uta-napishti's wife. Women drive the action of the Epic of Gilgamesh at every major turn of events, but it is the encounter with Shiduri perhaps most encapsulates the epic's philosophy of mortal life. We learn little about Shiduri directly, only that she was an innkeeper at the edge of the jeweled forest by the seashore, a beer brewer who kept her inn well stocked, with racks full of cups and golden vats for brewing. Also, Shiduri is modest. Wrapped in a shawl, her face was veiled, and also cautious, since she bolts the door and climbs up onto the roof at the repulsive, haggard, and grief-filled sight of Gilgamesh in his impetuous and rageful approach. Since few, if any, mortals travel these parts, we might infer that Shiduri's clientele include only the divine or the demi-divine, outliers in general, probably Urshanabi, maybe Uta-napishti and his wife. Shiduri's inn is the first in a long line of proverbial taverns at the edge of the world. A few might recognize Zaphod Beeblebrox's bar in Douglas Adams' A Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, or even the figure of Guinan in 10 Forward in Star Trek Next Generation. The opening scene of Tablet 10 is comical, with Gilgamesh shouting threats at Shiduri on her roof and her attempting to determine his intentions and identity. He tells her his story and the valid reasons for his grotesque, weather-worn, hobo-like appearance. We could compare here the wanderings of Odysseus, especially in his meeting with Nausicaa on the seashore. Then Gilgamesh asks her to tell him the way to Uta-napishti across the waters of death, and after some hedging and denying that it's possible or desirable, unless you are Shamash, the sun god, she instructs him to find Urshanabi, the boatsman, who is trimming cedar in the forest with the stone ones. We would know even less about the character of Shiduri and her important philosophy of life were it not for a fragment of this scene surviving from the Old Babylonian version. Helen notes this passage was cut from the standard version and replaced by Uta-napishti's much grimmer monologue. Hela tucks it away in an epilogue essay, dying to be read. I think this was probably a mistake. In Old Babylonian, Shiduri says to Gilgamesh, "Gilgamesh, where are you going? You will not find the life you seek. When the gods created humankind, they decreed death for the humans. Eternal life they kept for themselves. So Gilgamesh, fill your belly and be happy night and day. Let your days be merry, dance and play day and night. Let your clothes be clean, wash your head in water. Look at the child holding your hand. Let your wife delight in your embrace. This is the fate of humankind." In the first of his heretical essays on the philosophy of history, the Czech phenomenologist Jan Patočka comments very thoughtfully on Shiduri's wisdom. This speech is not hedonistic, as it is at times said to be, but rather a delimitation of human possibilities from the perspective of a finite life that is bound to itself. This maximum is the standard of a well-ordered household of private happiness, limited in time, overshadowed by the prospect of the end. This prospect does not make human life meaningless, as long as humans take their place in the framework of the life of the gods. Patočka's gloss on Shiduri's wisdom as far from hedonistic, but rather the perspective of a finite life bound to itself, and the nature of human happiness within life and within the divine world order, despite the inevitability of death, summarizes Shiduri's wisdom perfectly. Shiduri's advice is the first or second in a long line of what will later be called carpe diem, or seize the day, wisdom adages on the meaning of life, how to live well, and what is valuable or worthy in life. It is preceded in Egypt by the wisdom of Imhotep, and followed by the harper's song for Inher-Haki. In Judaism, this is the wisdom of Solomon in Ecclesiastes chapter 9, 1-12. In Greece, it is the kairos, or moment, starting with the poet Pindar, and it becomes a commonplace after the carpe diem in Horace's Roman odes, and through to Keats, Whitman, Waterhouse, and almost everywhere. As the archaic Greek poet Pindar puts it best, man is but the dream of a shadow. But whenever the God-given radiance arrives, a glorious brilliance is set upon men, and a gentle lifetime. It's the admonition to treat life more gently or enter into its gentleness that is at the core of Shiduri's advice to Gilgamesh. No wonder, if Shiduri is the source of such wisdom, an artist can depict her as a kind of Mary offering communion. This image on the left here, Shiduri's wisdom of banishment of the fear of death through gratitude to and affirmation of life, not gloom and paranoia, but sex, food, and dance, not only finds its way into Robin Williams' speeches in Good Will Hunting, it has become the basis of a new religion, Sidurianism. For Peter Deer, the founder of Sidurianism, in his The Epic of Gilgamesh, Teachings of Siduri, the three core components of Sidurian life philosophy are understanding, joy, and family. Family, because Siduri ends her advice to Gilgamesh with, "Look at the child that is holding your hand, and let your wife delight in your embrace." These things are the concern of men. Andrew George sees in Shiduri's good advice, which he glosses as, "Make merry, dance and play, keep nice and clean, enjoy the company of your family," the essential ground of human happiness, which is domestic harmony and simple living. And he even hears in the words subi and sabitu the little kissing noises made when you hold a baby. Because of the sparseness of her characterization and the ease with which she handles a dangerous Gilgamesh and the wisdom of her advice, Shiduri, even more than Shamhat, has become a placeholder in the modern imagination as it grapples with and reinvents its own Gilgamesh. Since the 19th century, she has been read as a Circe or Calypso figure from Homer's Odyssey, or a maidenly temptation for Gilgamesh in a garden of earthly delights, yet no indication is given of her age. The Jungian interpreter, Rivka S. Kluger, in her Archetypal Significance of Gilgamesh, reads Siduri as a maiden anima, related to Ishtar of Uruk, and attracting Gilgamesh back to the pleasures of life in the city. Here, for a change, Freudian and Jungian approaches cohere. Shiduri represents life affirmation and the pleasure principle, versus Uta-napishti's more pessimistic wisdom and reality principle. Hella, drawing from Rivka Harris, points out that we don't know if Siduri is a typical or exceptional tavern keeper given the cultural norms of the time. Were tavern keepers lewd and base, or were they expected to demonstrate restraint and offer wise words of advice to troubled customers? All we know is that Shiduri, like Shamhat, occupies a liminal position, but to an even more extreme degree. This is a woman who lives at the edges, not only of human, but of divine society as well. The presence of Urshanabi, the boatsman, near the jeweled forest by the ocean of death is as uncanny and liminal, perhaps even more so than Shiduri and her empty tavern. The text never explains whether these two figures are strictly mortal, or in some sense also divine. We are not given their backstory at all, and can only surmise. If mortals, Gilgamesh would not be the first mortal since Uta-napishti to make the journey this far. If part divine, the landscape they inhabit is still strangely depopulated. Urshanabi's name means literally servant of two-thirds, a poetic namesake closely aligned with Gilgamesh's destiny, we could say. The occupants of this uncanny realm seem designed with Gilgamesh in mind, which may make them figments of his imagination. Urshanabi will wind up accompanying Gilgamesh back to Uruk, a new companion. In typical fashion, and justifying Shiduri's fear of him, Gilgamesh first charges at Urshanabi, destroying his stonemen. It's business as usual for him, aggression first, questions later. Urshanabi then points out that Gilgamesh's aggression has done the most harm to himself. As the boatman dryly puts it, your own hands are holding you back. Gilgamesh's self-destructive streak is again on full display. Little has been learned. Hella interprets the stone men as stone golems that crew Urshanabi's ship. George reads them as amulets or pieces of the ship's equipment needed for its navigation or magical passage over the waters of death. Either way, what Gilgamesh has destroyed is the antediluvian tech that he needs to complete his journey. The reason sometimes given for his rash action is to prevent Urshanabi's maritime escape, but it's not quite clear. If Urshanabi's reaction to Gilgamesh's approach was anything like Shiduri's, then the attempted escape interpolation would make a lot of sense. That Gilgamesh's quest purpose is to uncover the secret knowledge that humans had before the flood may suggest another world mythology parallel for the Stone Ones. In Incan myth, the Stone Ones are massive statues, the antediluvian generation of giant humans that were created by Viracocha but discontinued. Are the Mesopotamian stone men talismans, statues, tech features of the boat, or robot oarsmen? We don't know. What follows Gilgamesh's destruction of the Stone Ones resembles a scene in Beckett's play Waiting for Godot. He tells his tale to Urshanabi the same as he did to Shiduri, somewhat confusedly. With the stone men out of commission, however, his quest is temporarily suspended. Gilgamesh's liminality between God and man has here become a liminoid state. Hence, Gilgamesh repeats and rehearses the traumas he has endured, above all, maggots falling from Enkidu's nose. He then presents Urshanabi with two alternatives: help me, or I wander onto death. This appears to solve a riddle, or at least it inclines Urshanabi towards Gilgamesh, since he next instructs Gilgamesh how to build a raft that can navigate the waters of death without the Stone Ones. And this is the most skill-based or manual labor-intensive of Gilgamesh's trials. He has to build a one-man makeshift emulation of Uta-napishti's whole city labor to build the ark. Gilgamesh and Urshanabi sail for 3 days towards Dilmun, the name of Uta-napishti's realm, before encountering the waters of death, which cannot be touched by mortal hand. Next, Urshanabi instructs Gilgamesh how to use a series of punting poles and how to create a sail from his clothing. Calasso glosses this as the world's first sail, but barely functional, since the breeze over the waters of death is so slight. Uta-napishti is, by this point, watching them from a distance, and he is wondering where the stone men have gone, and what this new rigging is, and who this new visitor might be. The text is fragmentary, but Uta-napishti can see Gilgamesh is no mere man. Unfortunately, Gilgamesh's first speech to Uta-napishti is fragmentary, but we get the idea from these lines. Gilgamesh said to him, "Long live Uta-napishti, son of Ubaratutu. After the flood that..." What? A flood. A similar disquisition follows, as with Shiduri and Urshanabi, as Gilgamesh relates his life story for a third time. This time, it ends with a lucid plea for healing. Now let the door of grief be closed. Seal its gate with pitch and tar. No more will dances stop for my sake. A king whose mere presence causes all dance and celebration to cease is a superlative kind of tragedy. Uta-napishti's first words in reply are pointed. Why, Gilgamesh, do you always chase grief? Scholars continue to parse out every aspect of Uta-napishti's words to Gilgamesh, which start with this reprimand. Gilgamesh has played the part of a fool. A good king would have listened to the advice of his counselors and his people and not arrived here in such a sorry state, chasing the impossible, but is to no avail. Theologically, Uta-napishti's advice in broken lines at first appears to be not dissimilar to Shiduri's, only it's more pitched from the divine perspective. Go home, Gilgamesh. Stop chasing eternal life and believing you're a god who needs no rest. Quote, only the gods do not rest, alert, awake, since ancient times. A good king's job is to help the gods to do their work via temples, offerings, and provisions, not to recklessly defy and work against the order of nature as set down by the gods, in endless, pointless confusion and pain. All Gilgamesh has accomplished with his overstraining outrageousness, captured in the German word Zorn, is to have hastened the day of his death. If only Nietzsche had read these words of Uta-napishti's, and there's a very slight chance he might have. More on that soon. The most famous part of Uta-napishti's pessimistic speech begins here, and I'll divide it up into two parts. Humans, your lines snap like reeds. The beautiful youth, the beautiful girl, abducted by death in their prime. No one sees death. No one sees the face of death. No one hears the voice of death. But it is savage death that snaps mankind. One day, we build a house. One day, we found a home. One day, the airs divided. One day, the suns grow bitter. One day, the river rose and brought high water. A mayfly drifting down the river, its face turned towards the sun. But even then, it could see nothing. Andrew George's remarks on the mayfly, or dragonfly, in other translations, is incisive. It's an image of the fragile brevity of man's life versus the infinite repetition of each generation's sunward turn as they float down a flooding river. The moral, George concludes, is that though a single man may die, men endure forever in the cycle of generations. This has been taken to be the meaning of the epic. Human immortality is at best collective and generational. This is the first part of Uta-napishti's speech, and it certainly appears to be our earliest statement of the type of philosophical pessimism that Nietzsche also espoused and believed he had recovered from Bronze Age Greece. Maybe it went back to Mesopotamia. George Burckhardt, an early German translator of Gilgamesh, sparked the possibly baseless rumor that Nietzsche knew and valued Gilgamesh. If so, it would have had to have been read to him after 1891, that is, a year after the onset of his madness. I doubt Nietzsche was ever exposed to Gilgamesh, but it may be just possible that one of his visitors to Weimar, where he was in the care of his sister, noticed the confirmation that the Epic of Gilgamesh gave to Nietzsche's pessimistic doctrines and brought a copy to be read to him, to which he responded positively. This is just possible at best and probably not worth speculating more on. More interesting would be to rethink Nietzsche's published writings and conceptual personae, like Zarathustra, after Gilgamesh, and there's a lot here that could be explored. Uta-napishti's speech continues, closing tablet 10. How similar are death and abduction, and one cannot draw the image of death. No one has ever greeted a dead man. The Anunnaki were assembled, the great gods, Mami, maker of destinies, fixed fates for them. The gods gave humans life and death, but did not reveal which day you would die. The second part of Uta-napishti's speech, where he says how similar are death and abduction, and one cannot draw the image of death, no one has ever greeted a dead man, reads in part like a mythic source text or grounding note, underlying the most adventurous text of 20th century philosophy, Martin Heidegger's Being and Time. There's almost no secondary literature which reads Gilgamesh in light of canonical existential philosophers, but I find it hard to believe that the voracious reader Heidegger had not heard of and read the available German versions of Gilgamesh by 1927. Not that we need Heidegger or Nietzsche or the Greeks, for that matter, to read and understand Gilgamesh. Nonetheless, the conclusion that Uta-napishti is one of the world's first philosophers of death is unavoidable. Uta-napishti is the immortal thinker, literally, who drew from the premise of the similarity of death and abduction a startling conclusion, namely that we can draw no conceptual or figurative image of death. On this reading, Uta-napishti's pessimism not only provides one of world history's first extended meditations on the impossibility of knowing death, since death is unrepresentable, it indirectly drives home a key point, central to Heidegger, that the other's death is inaccessible to me. No one has ever greeted a dead man. Death is what whisks us away, from ourselves, from each other, away from the there. Death is the closure of any horizon or possibility of reciprocal understanding or greeting of meaning in the world. Famously, in Heidegger's analysis of being towards death, a corpse cannot divulge death's secret. In Heidegger's landmark analysis in Being and Time, the human being, which he calls Dasein, being there, is always and essentially an anxious being towards the possibility of its own impossibility. Only being towards death temporalizes and escorts mortal humans into their authenticity, Eigentlichkeit, or properness, or ownness, which Heidegger understands as a temporal, historical abiding with others. Gilgamesh, at the turning point of Uta-napishti's speech, and in his slow absorption of the wisdom of Shiduri, is discovering his Eigentlichkeit, what is proper to him, and it involves a return to Uruk, to take up his social role as king in a more productive way, and engage with his temporal historical abiding with others. So what better describes, if very anachronistically, Gilgamesh's transition from an inauthentic to an authentic relationship to his mortal finitude, from Tablet 10 to Tablet 11, then Heidegger's analysis of being towards death. Is Gilgamesh's quest not also Heidegger's? Minus any mention of Heidegger, Helle is on a similar track here, as he unpacks Uta-napishti's wisdom. Death is at one and the same time completely certain and completely uncertain. The gods have decreed that we must die, so die we must. Death is the one certainty we have in life, but the gods also left us in painful ignorance of when our death will occur. We know that we must die, but not when, where, or how it will come about, or how it will feel, because no one sees death or hears its voice. We know nothing about death except its certainty. Helle is acutely aware that the most compelling aspects of Gilgamesh's relationship to death and eternal life, his being towards death, hinges on the transition from Tablets 10 to 11. As Helle reflects, Uta-napishti's monologue is a poetic feat, but it is not the only perspective on death found in the epic. Gilgamesh's emotional journey from bravado at the story's beginning to despair at the end can be mapped through his changing relation to death. More precisely, Gilgamesh moves from disdain of death to the desire for eternal fame, through the love of Enkidu, which binds him to the fear of loss, into the trauma of Enkidu's death, and from there into the all-devouring obsession with avoiding death himself. However, by the middle of Tablet 11, as we'll look to now, and immediately after hearing Uta-napishti's tales of the deluge and his own immortalization, Gilgamesh anticipates that his quest is over. Finally, he accepts that he will die. This shift of perspective occurs abruptly when he replies in Tablet 11, "The thief of life has a hold on my heart. Death is sitting in my bedroom, and wherever I turn, there too is death." Previously, in Tablet 10 and throughout the series, Gilgamesh did little else but strain against the certainty of death, as against all limits on his action and their success. But now he anxiously accepts the certainty of his death. From this point forward, according to Helle, for Gilgamesh, death is not a sudden snapping, but a constant presence. Death is everywhere. In short, Tablet 11 marks Gilgamesh's transition from inauthentic to authentic being towards death. At the opening of Tablet 11, Gilgamesh said to him, to the faraway Uta-napishti, "I look at you, Uta-napishti, and your body is no different. You are just like me. You are no different. You are just like me. My heart was all set on fighting you, but now that I see you, my arms fall limp. Tell me, how did you find eternal life in the gathering of gods?" And Uta-napishti said to him, to Gilgamesh, "I will tell you a secret, Gilgamesh, and reveal what the gods keep hidden." Invariably considered the climax of the series, Uta-napishti's tale, which is based on and fills out the Atrahasis tablet, is masterful poetry in Akkadian and has been pored over by generations of scholars in every detail. It's the speech that made Gilgamesh famous when George discovered it. In this course, coverage of the details of Tablet 11, was the arc a cube or a coracle, for example, may occur in the context of the Atrahasis lecture, but for now, let's explore the main themes with discussion of their impact on Gilgamesh and its outcome for his narrative journey. Uta-napishti's name means literally, he found life, and he is the same figure as Atrahasis. He is very wise. He is a mythical figure, as ancient to Gilgamesh as Gilgamesh is to us. And like Gilgamesh, although much more directly, Uta-napishti has a special relationship with the god Enki, or Ea. It is Ea, a trickster god, equal to Enlil, who exploits a divine loophole when he informs Uta-napishti through coded signs that he must build a great boat. Why did Ea choose Uta-napishti to circumvent his oath of silence in the Inuna Council is not clear. Ea spoke to him through a fence of reeds, or chinks in the wall, allowing him to overhear Ea's thoughts. We could compare Pyramus and Thisbe in Ovid, or in Shakespeare's A Midsummer's Night Dream. Ea's first message to Uta-napishti orders him to build a boat and explains how to do so, but not why. He only tells the sage to flee, not what it is he is fleeing from. This is a bit like God's test of faith to Abraham. Uta-napishti, Ashuruppak, a city as old to Gilgamesh as Uruk is to us, asks Ea how he is to explain to his city this madcap project, or how he is to pay for the project. What follows poetically, as explored by Worthington, the book on the left here, cited in Hella, is grim irony. The citizens who build the ark are richly rewarded for their labor, but in a series of puns, their reward spells their own death and destruction. As Hella puts it, Ea's coded message spells death for everyone, if spelled correctly. The ambiguity here for those listening to an oral performance of Tablet 11 is that only those who understand Ea's message correctly might have a chance to save themselves, while the rest feast on cake, booze, and work, which Hella calls a cruel lesson in literary criticism. Many ironies structure the tale. Take the unfortunate shipwright, who is made to seal the ship from the outside, saving those inside, but consigning himself to death. I gave my palace and all its treasures to Pusur-Enlil, the shipwright, who caulked the hatch from outside. The grim irony is that Pusur-Enlil, whose name means protected by Enlil, will not have long to enjoy his newfound wealth. The monumental ship is sealed and drifts in the cataclysm with all the wealth, seeds, family and kin, herds and creatures of the wild, and experts of all kinds of crafts that it can fit. The flood and fire, or total world catastrophe which follows, is described in graphic detail. Even the gods grew afraid of the spectacle, regretting their compliance with Enlil's plan, and they fled to Anu's skies, curled up like dogs. The image of gods curled up like dogs as they implore Anu underlines the depth of the horror they witnessed during the flood. As Hella contextualizes, the story of the flood gives the mythical background for two central elements of Babylonian culture, omens and offerings. Without offerings, the gods would go hungry, meaning that they were dependent on humans. Conversely, the humans were dependent on the gods' every whim, however ill-considered, and their only way of deducing those whims was through omens and dreams. On this reading, Ea's subterfuge is what provides an etiology of the first omen. His foresighted rationale in communicating to Uta-napishti is simply to ensure that offerings on which the gods depend will not be permanently discontinued. As Hella continues, in the Babylonian worldview, time was split in two. There was a time before the flood and a time after the flood, and even an ancient king like Gilgamesh belonged to the latter. What made the flood special was that the destruction it wrought was all-englobing. Everything was destroyed, and everyone not on Uta-napishti's ship killed. So the time before the flood could not be known in any way. The storm had erased all records, monuments, and witnesses of the past. Observing the catastrophe, Belit-ili, the mother goddess and creator of humanity, cries out, "All the past has turned to clay," meaning that everything and everyone was transformed by the flood into a malleable mass with no form or face, like a wet lump of clay. Eventually, Uta-napishti's ship lands aground on the Mountain of Secrets for 7 days. A dove, sparrow, and crow are sent off successively to find dry land. Only the crow returns. At the end of the tale, Uta-napishti emerges to make the first offering after the flood and says, "I brought out a sacrifice to the 4 winds and offered incense to the mountain peak. I laid out 7 offering bowls and 7 more, with sweet reed, cedar, and myrtle underneath. The gods smelt the sweet scent. The gods swarmed to the sacrifice like flies. As soon as Belit-ili arrived, she held up the mighty jeweled flies that Anu had made to seduce her. Gods, I will hang these flies like beads around my neck to remind me of those days I must never forget. Now let the gods all come to the sacrifice. Only Enlil is not welcome at the sacrifice because he caused the flood, acting without counsel, consigning my people to the slaughter." Although not welcome, this is when Enlil, king of the gods and storm god, shows up anyhow, furious, but calmed by Ea and the other gods, who all advise him to adopt a more fair and measured approach to his culling of the human infestation. Gods, to be gods, should avert unjust suffering, a moral theological view emerging in this tale, and ensure the continuance of offerings. Not unlike in the Atrahasis tablet, where Enlil shows compassion to the Igigi slave gods who storm his encampment in the first quasi- or anachronistically Marxian revolutionary uprising of gods against gods, here Enlil relinquishes his murderous flood rage, boards Uta-napishti's boat, and blesses Uta-napishti and his wife with immortal life. Enlil says, "In the past, Uta-napishti was human. Now he and his wife will be like us gods. Uta-napishti shall live far away, where the rivers rise." And Uta-napishti remarks, "They took me far away and made me live where rivers rise." Enlil, who had evidently hated the human race here and throughout the Atrahasis tablet, now appears to make a new covenant. No wonder Gilgamesh so concerns biblical scholars. The reason for Enlil's change of heart and mind is not stated directly, but 4 factors appear to be in play. 1. The wise, confrontational criticism of his unilateral verdict by Ea. 2. The mournful guilt complicity of the Council of the Gods and their desire for justice. 3. The gods' need for human offerings in perpetuity. And 4. Possibly the sight of human ingenuity, Atrahasis' capacity to listen to omens and to build the ark. Uta-napishti's tale wraps up expeditiously, and he says to Gilgamesh, "But now, what will convene the gods for your sake, so you too can find the life that you seek? Come, try to stay awake for 6 days and 7 nights." Earlier, in Tablet 9, Gilgamesh had declared, "I seek the way to my ancestor, Uta-napishti, who found eternal life in the gathering of gods. He will tell me the secret of life and death." Now, having heard the secret, the truth about what happened during and after the deluge, Gilgamesh intuits that his petition, or case for immortality, based on his 2/3 god status or accomplishments, many of them offenses to the gods, is the last thing that merits a divine council to hear his case. Uta-napishti proposes a mock challenge. "So you think your 2/3 divinity really outweigh your 1/3 humanity? Just try to stay awake after all you've endured." But as soon as Gilgamesh squatted down, sleep blew over him like a fog. While Enlil could not sleep because of human commotion, Gilgamesh could only sleep. The brag by Shamhat at the outset to Enkidu that Gilgamesh never sleeps proves hollow. His confessions to Shiduri and Urshanabi that he longs for sweet sleep is what overtakes our hero as soon as he reaches his goal and has heard the secret. Secrets require time and sleep to process, and dreams, but Gilgamesh's sleep is dreamless, in contrast to his earlier sleeps. This sleep is dreamless in exhaustion and dejection. Uta-napishti and his wife have a 7-day conversation over Gilgamesh's sleeping body. Uta-napishti's wife, who goes unnamed, unfortunately, proposes waking him and sending him home forthwith. Not very hospitable. However, she will later propose directing Gilgamesh to his last consolation, which is the plant of youth. At least he will return with something for his troubles. It is Uta-napishti who proposes to lay out 7 loaves of bread to prove to Gilgamesh that he slept so long. This demonstration is necessary, as he says, because mortals are so deceptive. When Gilgamesh wakes, he tries to claim he just nodded off, and so the couple's point is sufficiently demonstrated. And Gilgamesh instantly shifts his self-understanding towards his mortality. Gilgamesh's plaint and the turning point from his inauthentic to authentic being towards death. "How can I go on, Uta-napishti? Where should I go? The thief of life has a hold on my heart. Death is sitting in my bedroom, and wherever I turn, there too is death." In reply to this, Uta-napishti, perhaps himself a journeyer on Urshanabi's boat to Shiduri's tavern on occasion, we could guess, utters a verdict for both Gilgamesh and Urshanabi. Urshanabi will no longer be Uta-napishti's boatman. Is this a punishment? But Urshanabi will cleanse, bathe, restore, and dress Gilgamesh in a royal mantle worthy of his dignity. He will also accompany Gilgamesh home to the city of Uruk, a second companion, after Enkidu, but by no means a substitute, until he arrives home in his city Until he reaches the end of his road, the mantle will stay new and unblemished. Eternally unblemished clothing is a recurrent motif in many world mythologies. Why? Perhaps because there are moments in life when what you wear declares who you are. Also, it's always a misery to see your best finery decay before you do. Time's reach is a mystery. The journey home, after a wanderer life of dirty pelt attire, again, compare Odysseus, Gilgamesh's nostos is simple and elegant. He will arrive home in the dignified appearance declared by Uta-napishti himself, and his appearance will present his knowledge. Gilgamesh and Urshanabi boarded the boat, they launched the ferry, and sailed away. So long, or so it would seem. While they are still in view, however, they are called back. Considering the mythic stature in this narrative of female figures like Shamhat, Ninsun, Ishtar, the Scorpion Wife, and Shiduri, it's important to underline that it is Uta-napishti's wife, perhaps an amalgam of all these wise women, who brings Gilgamesh back to the shore for one last piece of advice and one last quest. His wife said to him, to the faraway Uta-napishti, Gilgamesh struggled and strained to come here, but what did you give him to bring back home? Then Gilgamesh raised the punting pole and brought the boat back to shore. Uta-napishti said to him, to Gilgamesh, Gilgamesh, you struggled and strained to come here, but what did I give you to bring back home? In other words, Uta-napishti has pathos and care for Gilgamesh, but it takes his wife to suggest a remedy after his departure. One last secret remains. The rub of it, in the Mitchell translation, there is a small spiny bush that grows in the waters of the great deep. It has sharp spikes that will prick your fingers like roses' thorns. If you find this plant and bring it to the surface, you will have found the secret of youth. The relationship of Uta-napishti and his wife in this scene strikes me archetypally as influencing the characters of Enkidu, the scientist of the Southern Oracle, and Urgel, his wizened witchy wife, in Michael Ende's originally German all-ages novel, The Never-Ending Story, published in 1979. In that tale, Enkidu advises Sebastian about his expertise in quest science, while Urgel feeds him witchy potions. Their mythic avatars seem somewhat related to Uta-napishti and his wife here, a kind of children's slapstick version. Uta-napishti goes on, telling Gilgamesh a kind of third secret. In the Hella translation, I will tell you a secret, Gilgamesh, and reveal what the gods keep hidden. There is a plant that looks like a thistle, whose thorns, like a wild rose, hurt your hands. If you can find and pluck this plant, you will win back your life force. And here comes the really interesting bit. When Gilgamesh heard this, he dug a shaft down to the Apsu. He tied heavy stones to his feet. They pulled him down to the Apsu. He grasped and plucked the plant. It hurt his hand, and he cut the heavy stones from his feet, and the sea threw him back on the beach. It looks like Uta-napishti's third secret is what leads to Gilgamesh's most important life event, his dive into Ea's Apsu. Translators like to adapt this scene, putting it far off the shores of Dilmun, even in the waters of death, but the scene stays on the shore itself, or close to it, and its direction is downward. Foster suggests the Apsu is dug open in the earth itself, and it then sucks Gilgamesh into it before spitting him out in the ocean. In world mythology terms, this scene is a variation on the earth diver motif, wherein a primal being descends into the depth of the primal waters to bring back mud or earth. The dive into Ea's or Enki's Apsu is Gilgamesh's earth diver quest, and I would say it's his most important accomplishment. For it might be the bald fact that Gilgamesh has swam in Ea's Apsu, or Enki's Sea of Knowledge, which confers or seals his total knowledge. That he loses the plant of rejuvenation may be less significant. It was through swimming in Ea's Apsu that he came to know the ways and learn all things, as we heard in the prologue. There is additional evidence for this in the text, as when Ninsun said near the start of the quest that Gilgamesh will grow wise with Ea in the Apsu. Also recall how the standard version began by describing Gilgamesh as he who saw the deep. His triumph was to bring home a secret from before the flood. but it may be his having swam in Ea's Apsu, which initiates and seals in Gilgamesh his emerging wisdom and near total knowledge. Gilgamesh said to him, to the boatman Urshanabi, "Urshanabi, this is the plant of the pulsing heart. The man who finds it will win back his life force. I will bring it home to Uruk, the sheepfold. I will make an old man eat from it. If the old man grows young again, I will eat it too, and return to my youth." If only he had eaten the plant on the spot. His plan to test it out on one of his citizens reflects a suspicious cast of mind. Was Uta-napishti tricking him, or it might indicate culinary norms for kingship? It also conveys the sense of an ethnobotanical experiment, although there is no evidence that the plant was psychoactive. In any case, Gilgamesh's quest is a one-way journey. There are no lions, scorpion men, sun tunnels, Shiduris, stone men, or shaman couples on his way home. Only hundreds of miles. Carelessly, Gilgamesh sets the plant down to take a break from the heat, dirt, and sweat, and swim in a cooling pool. A snake smelt the scent of the plant. It slid up in silence. It snatched it away and shed its skin as it slithered back. The philosopher Heraclitus, who we quoted on Polemos, Struggle or Strife, earlier, also taught that nature, or phusis, loves to conceal itself, or loves to hide, and that the oracle at Delphi, or the Pythia, neither reveals nor conceals, but gives a sign. The snake's shedding of its skin appears to be such a sign. Biblically, the plant of rejuvenation reminds us of forbidden fruit. This serpent does not seduce Eve or Adam into nudity, self-knowledge, or morality. Instead, the serpent acts as nature, phusis, does in Heraclitus's fragment. It withdraws with the secret of rejuvenation or life force intact and indemnified, demonstrated even. Gilgamesh's only consolation ends up empowering a serpent, or perhaps what the serpent represents. Is this an indirect gift to Ishtar? A homecoming gift? Then Gilgamesh sat down crying, tears streaming down his cheeks, and said to the boatsman Urshanabi, "I have worn out my arms, but for what? For whom did I spill the blood of my heart? I got my reward, but not for myself. I gave it instead to this underground lion. Now all around us the tide has been rising. When I dug the shaft, I threw away the tools. And if I went back, how could I find the same spot? I even left the boat on the beach. At this moment, there is no going back. There is only acceptance." The epic ends. They stopped to eat after 100 miles. They pitched their camp after 200 miles. They arrived at Uruk, the sheepfold, and Gilgamesh said to him, to Urshanabi, "Climb the wall of Uruk, Urshanabi, walk its length, survey the foundation, study the brickwork. There, is it not made of oven-baked bricks? Did the 7 sages not lay its cornerstone? Look, 2,000 acres for the city, 2,000 acres for the orchards, 2,000 acres for the pits of clay, and 2,000 acres for the temple of Ishtar. 7,000 acres is the size of Uruk." Gilgamesh has returned home, and in the process of his journey, he's become a kind of philosopher, or a figure we might recognize as one, like Uta-napishti. It may be sheer coincidence, but when philosophy began among the pre-Socratic Greeks, the first 7 greatest philosophers of that lineage were often called the 7 sages. Who the 7 sages are in this much earlier context is not relayed, so let's attempt a little to interpret the return. Many readers, including the great Sumerologist Thorkild Jakobsen, have found the ending deeply unsatisfying. It, quote, "does not come to a harmonious end. The emotions which raged in it are not assuaged, nor is there, as in tragedy, any sense of catharsis, any fundamental acceptance of the inevitable. It is a jeering, unhappy, unsatisfactory ending. An inner turmoil is left to rage on. A vital question finds no answer." More recent generations of readers have found more to admire, and I tend to find the ending quite cathartic. Think back to Tablet 1, where we heard, "Gilgamesh, the great, magnificent, and terrible. He reached through his toils the faraway Uta-napishti. He rebuilt the temples that the flood had destroyed, and established the right rituals for vast humankind. Clearly, Gilgamesh's quest has not been a complete failure. He has not achieved immortality. He has not even benefited from the plant of eternal youth, but he has come back with a secret knowledge that he shares, renovating his city further and also renewing religious observances from antediluvian times. In the process, he has given up restless, unsatisfied roving, always wanting more, and become equal to, or coincident with himself. As Bakhtin's narrative theory would say, he is captured in his text. As Hela puts Gilgamesh's success, he becomes, literally, one who saw the deep. He becomes the story of his life, nothing but words on a tablet, and that is the price of immortality. The beginning ties in with the end, an Ouroboros image or snake biting its own tail. The prologue tells readers to take up the tablet box and open the door to its secrets, and Gilgamesh returns with these secrets, beginning and end. It is the view from the massive walls of the city of Uruk that count the most. The city, or the tale, is the only immortality, and the secret knowledge which Gilgamesh acquired is just barely intimated in the text we have. The quest is not a failure, for Gilgamesh has listened, observed, and traveled. Failing to become immortal, he returns home with insight, the good king that Uruk needs, and with an immortal tale. To the scribal culture that transcribed Gilgamesh, the text was likely full of secrets. To the average Akkadian or Babylonian audience, Gilgamesh was first and foremost understood to be a judge and ruler in the underworld, someone everyone is likely to meet after death. Knowing the tale of his exploits might have given pride to the citizens of Uruk and may have been a form of preparatory knowledge for their own death. In his excellent essay, Dying to be Read, Hela goes into many other fascinating ways to understand the ending as a mise en abîme, the story within the story, and its multiple layers of literary recursion, often centering around clay as a symbol of both permanence and impermanence, the brittle or fired clay tablets on which scribes transmit Gilgamesh's autobiography, or the foundational fired bricks of Uruk's wall. Beginning and end tie together in reiteration, repetition, and return, but with a difference, which might lead to a delusion reading of the epic. As Keith Dixon surmises, what cannot be accomplished everlastingly once and for all may still be achieved in a serial fashion. The series of Gilgamesh is a tale that renews itself through its retelling, like the snake shedding its skin. Even in the loss and absence of all originals, the original king as first-person narrator, the lapis lazuli original tablets, or even Uruk's original walls, should inundation recur, the story, while fixed, continues to solicit readers to re-enter Gilgamesh's vast mind and extraordinary experiences. Gilgamesh becomes motionless, while his readers and listeners are set in motion as they contemplate the whole, the collective culture and historical situation that Gilgamesh passes down as a heritage. Gilgamesh ends his journey by surrendering to his city, society, and role. A surrender to Ishtar may even be implied by the penultimate line, and 1,000 acres for the temple of Ishtar. Ishtar thus becomes the last named deity in the text, a fitting nod to the goddess of Uruk and to Gilgamesh's duty as king. We'll cover here the mysterious Tablet 12 lightly in just 2 slides before reflecting on the meaning of Gilgamesh. Tablet 12 serves as something of an appendix and was translated from an older Sumerian tablet, possibly by Sîn-leqi-unnenni himself, or whoever the redactors and compilers were. Its plot is difficult, if not impossible, to reconcile with the 11 preceding tablets, which stand as a literary whole. Adapters and interpreters have tended to select from, edit, or omit entirely, or integrate its contents elsewhere. Hela includes only the second half of Tablet 12 in his translation, the part in which Enkidu, inexplicably alive again, descends to the underworld to retrieve Gilgamesh's ball and mallet, which fell into a crack. Enkidu dies in this quest, and his ghost returns to relate what he has witnessed. The cosmological prologue and Inana-Gilgamesh relationship that unfolds in the opening scenes of Tablet 12 I find to be more interesting, and you can find coverage of them in my lecture, The Mythology of Inana. The opening of Tablet 12 should not be overlooked, for it shows how from the start Gilgamesh's story is also Ishtar's story. Because of its placement after Tablet 11, some adapters, including Roberto Calasso, have imagined that fashioning a couch and throne from the wood of the hulupu tree for Ishtar and a ball and mallet or drum and drumstick for himself might occur after the quest and return. If so, the Enkidu, who descends to the underworld to retrieve the ball and mallet, would have to be another citizen playing the role of Enkidu in games and rites that Gilgamesh institutes after his return and in Enkidu's memory. I find the suggestion that Tablet 12 continues the narrative to be unlikely. Tablet 12 depicts less mature and more cooperative versions of both Inana and Gilgamesh, with little trace of the adversariality that characterized their relationship in the standard version. If the opener to Tablet 12 is a Sumerian afterimage which appears to contradict older and later Babylonian versions, then the question is why include it at all? Clearly, for what it tells us about the netherworld. If Tablet 12 fits anywhere in the plot structure of the standard version, it could have been worked into Tablets 7 to 8, Enkidu's dream, death, and funeral, and some plot coherence could have been achieved. Either Enkidu would have dreamed his descent into the netherworld and related these dreams to Gilgamesh while he was murmuring on his deathbed, or Gilgamesh would have summoned the ghost of Enkidu during or after the funeral. Either way, the detail in Tablet 12 that Enkidu lost his life attempting to retrieve Gilgamesh's sporting goods doesn't fit the plot. Non-specialists such as myself can only look to George's translation of the Sumerian Gilgamesh tablets and speculate mostly blindly as to sources used by the scribal authors of the standard version. Is Enkidu's dream of the Council of the Gods a redo on Gilgamesh's dream of the Council of the Gods? And we can ask to what extent Enkidu's funeral in Tablet 8 is modeled on Gilgamesh's funeral in the Sumerian Death of Gilgamesh. This sounds like a PhD project that's already happened, and lo and behold, Alhena Gadari has written a book, Gilgamesh Enkidu in the Netherworld and the Sumerian Gilgamesh Cycle, which I look forward to reading. So for the general audience and my state university students, Tablet 12 and other versions of Gilgamesh that have survived cannot but taunt us with tantalizing flashes. The fact that it was included as an appendix in Ashurbanipal's library copy almost makes it look like the definitive version was still a work in progress at that time too. Or perhaps, more deliberatively, Tablet 12 stands as an appendix precisely because it re-begins the tale and takes us back to the young Gilgamesh and his first accomplishments. Or the tablet simply couldn't be omitted because of the need to know details it contained about the structure of the underworld. The laws of the underworld Enkidu relates are strange indeed, relative well-being below coinciding only with one metric above, the number of progeny left behind to make offerings. And strangely, it is only the large number of Gilgamesh tablets that were copied out, perhaps as offerings, which has resulted in us knowing as much of Gilgamesh as we do. Tablet 12 deserves a much longer treatment, but one last point that Michael Schmidt points out, drawing from Andrew George, is that other than the references to Enkidu as a kind of blushing bride, it's Tablet 12 that provides the most direct evidence that Gilgamesh's and Enkidu's relationship was explicitly sexual. When Gilgamesh meets, hugs, and kisses the returned shade of Enkidu, Enkidu laments to Gilgamesh, "My friend, the penis that you touched, so your heart rejoiced, a grub devours it like an old garment." Winding to a close here, we can ask just a little bit, what does Gilgamesh mean? While many have focused on the core themes, death, immortality, and loss, others have pointed to the equally central themes of eros and sexuality, and to the conflict of matriarchy and patriarchy that may subtend the text. Rudolf Pannwitz, another early translator into German and disciple of the poet Stefan Georg, renders the opening of Gilgamesh in 1921 like so in Zielkowski's English translation of Pannwitz's German. This is a nameless work about the hero and human destiny. He saw all, the master of the land, the sublime one, the questioning one, the weighty one. Of everything's possibility and completion he learned. He understood everything. He fathomed his people's actions. Like the god, he judged and set it right. For Pannwitz, all themes related to human possibility, completion, and understanding are found in this nameless work. Over 40 years later, in 1966, and still untranslated into English, Pannwitz returned to Gilgamesh and published his Gilgamesh, Socrates, Titanism and Humanism. There he argued that Gilgamesh is Titanism personified, a reckless, overreaching striving that cannot avail, like the Titan gods in Greek myth, and yet his story ends in the birth of humanism. In this reading, Enkidu represents prehistoric humanity, prior to the hunter-gatherer and agricultural economy. Their defeat of Humbaba, rejection of Ishtar, and killing of the bull of heaven collectively represent the, quote, break with the old religion of matriarchy and the violent elevation of a new religion, the solar and titanic religion of the Übermensch, Overman. On Pannwitz's Nietzsche-inflected reading, Gilgamesh marks a break with matriarchy and prehistory. It is a vast lament, witness the travails, that bears witness to the emergence of humanity's individualized self-consciousness, beyond rituals and mysteries. It is also the first resounding of the pessimistic wisdom of Silenus that so terrified and enthralled Nietzsche. It is all in vain, man is hopelessly mortal. For Pannwitz, and I tend to agree with this part, had Nietzsche been able to read Gilgamesh in the early 1880s, instead of or alongside the hymns or gathas of Zoroaster, his greatest work might have been titled Thus Spoke Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh and its scribal culture among the old Babylonians and later Assyrians, what we are witnessing is the early stages of the death of Titanism and the emergence of humanism. This over 1,000 years before the Greeks invented their Homeric Olympus, and well before any Greek humanisms. Pannwitz declares it is humanity's challenge to attain the integration of pre- and post-history, and this is what Gilgamesh calls out to us to do. For better or for worse, Gilgamesh's and humanity's Titanism is inextinguishable. Straining beyond our limits, transgressing boundaries, is the human life force, which all humanisms, past and future, can only temper. As both Titanism and humanism metamorphosize from chaos to cosmos, a transition from the gaping chasm, from death as nothingness, to Nietzsche's dancing star. Whereas the early Nietzsche superficially opposed and yet deeply married Apollonian and Dionysian drives, and developed a critique of the figure of Socrates and Socratic rationalism as symptoms and stages of decline, Pannwitz boldly, and perhaps a little madly, imagines the reunification of Gilgamesh's Titanism with Western philosophy. Not yet having carefully studied Pannwitz's book, I find these suggestions troubling, yet intriguing. Of course, his association with the George Circle and Walter Kaufmann's rehabilitation of Nietzsche's reputation to the broadly American cultural audience of the 1960s buried much of any reception for this work. Ziolkowski also seems mildly fascinated and concludes his overview, whereas Pannwitz was writing on a lofty philosophical level for students of cultural history and philosophy. Another work of the 1960s addressed itself to the broader audience of readers newly interested in the Epic of Gilgamesh. A very diplomatic way to register the intrinsic interest that Pannwitz's ideas still have without having to bear the responsibility of a final judgment on his work. While Pannwitz drew from Jungian theory, the most interesting Jungian book on Gilgamesh did not appear until 1991. Mentioned earlier, this was Rivka S. Kluger's Archetypal Significance of Gilgamesh, a Modern Ancient Hero. Kluger's work on Gilgamesh was inspired by her contact with Carl Jung in 1948 and by his personal encouragement. Ziolkowski, in high praise for him, finds this book not only a reasonable Jungian interpretation of the Gilgamesh myth, but also a highly readable introduction to the epic itself. For Kluger, Gilgamesh unfolds two things: eternal archetypal events and their levels of development in human consciousness. The mythic Gilgamesh here becomes a kind of modern Hermes, advanced scout, liminal messenger, or interpretive forerunner of human transformation. For Gilgamesh is always a step ahead of the consciousness of this time, like Jung's spirit of the depth versus the zeitgeist. Kluger's conclusion on the meaning of the epic is intriguing. Shows the Gilgamesh epic as a whole shows in its inner structure a process of transformation in the collective unconscious, an anticipation of the individuation process, and at the same time, it mirrors a significant era in the history of religion, a time when the great goddess Ishtar was defeated by the hero under the aegis of Shamash. Any attempt to render a final meaning to Gilgamesh based on text or reception would be pointless. As Michael Schmidt put the modern Gilgamesh reception brilliantly in a nutshell, Gilgamesh remains vulnerable, clearly affects readers and writers. It is also impacted upon, commandeered, reread, and misread. It has suffered the fate of long-established classical text, but being a newcomer, it has suffered in a more accelerated form. It has been annexed and academicized, put upon, traduced, or, as we might say, colonized in a postmodern spirit. Schmidt also underlines, a leitmotif in Hela, it has not had enough time to sink in. In the series of Gilgamesh, we are reading a tale grimmer and more magically realist than Homer's Iliad or Odyssey, more finely constructed than Shakespeare's Tempest, and just as imaginative as Cervantes' Don Quixote. No wonder it concerned Rilke, who found in Gilgamesh a primal window into the world of the dead as true being, versus the living, versus us, who are only ever the ephemeral exceptions. Yes, Gilgamesh concerns us. More zoomed out, my own interest in Gilgamesh has often been honed on how and why the figure of Ishtar Inanna is disfigured and or reconfigured across our fragmentary versions. This is unsurprising since, as Helen notes, Ishtar is a central character in Babylonian poetry, and with good reason. Her poetic potential is endless. And yet, for some reason, Sîn-leqi-unnenni, or whoever the editors and compilers were, chose to let Ishtar stand in the poem, often in a reduced form, perhaps even as a historical curiosity, an exurg or appendix. I struggled with closing this lecture until I turned to Italian author Roberto Calasso, recently deceased, who sums up the Gilgamesh-Ishtar and Gilgamesh-Uta-napishti relation with great perspicacity and style. The last of his 11-part series devoted to the world's mythologies, Calasso unfolds an academically informed, yet fictional, retelling of Mesopotamian mythology, told in the voice of Uta-napishti to Sinbad, the legendary shipwrecked Arabian sailor from the Abbasid Caliphate in the 8th century CE, whose tale we find in the 1001 Nights. After Gilgamesh, for Calasso, Sinbad is the last visitor to Uta-napishti's shores. They exchange stories, and Uta-napishti narrates. Gilgamesh came here as a stranger, a foreigner, standing tall in Urshanabi's boat. He was worn out, pale, distraught. When Gilgamesh spoke to me, the first thing we talked about was the many risks he had run and the challenges he had faced to reach me. Every word reminded me of someone else, someone who spoke the same way, Ishtar. She was the only one of the Anunnaki who told stories of the rivers and marshes and mountains she had crossed, of the icy cold and suffocating heat that had oppressed and bruised her beauty. Goddess and the man who refused to be her lover seemed to take turns at telling the same story, as if that story tied them together more than the bed they hadn't shared. I knew it and dreaded it. I was the one who would have to explain to Gilgamesh that his adventures were to no avail. Man is as fleeting as a dragonfly that flits for a day over the waters of the Euphrates and is gone. It was a hateful task, but that was why the Anunnaki had given it to me. I did what I had to do. Afterward, I was pierced by the sharpest of pains, a moment of torment that has stayed with me ever since, and will be with me, I imagine, forever. When Gilgamesh departed, like a gust of wind, he left me with a constant craving to speak of him. After the apparition that was Gilgamesh, there was a long, interminable period in which nothing happened. If my task had been to dispel Gilgamesh's last illusions, I had certainly done the job and could now consider myself superfluous. I began to think the Anunnaki had forgotten me. I was of no use to them anymore, and perhaps They were of no use to me, who would never die. But I felt no relief. On the contrary, new poison seeped into me. Uta-napishti concludes, as we will hear, one day it occurred to me, perhaps the Anunnaki had wanted this. They had arranged it all. They wanted a voice to tell the stories that happened before the flood, and I was the only one still alive. I had been part of those stories, or they had been told to me, and that's why I have gone on speaking to you. Sometimes I had the feeling I was speaking to myself, but now I know that those stories, or at least the last splinters of them, and always with big gaps between one and another, are alive in you too. Like you, they have escaped death. So thank you everyone for following along with this first attempt at a lecture on Gilgamesh as you go deeper into your own journey with this remarkable text. Thanks for listening everyone, and see you next week.